At 65, my own son drugged me and abandoned me on a frozen island off the coast of Alaska to seize my shipping empire, all to take over the empire I had built over 40 years. And he planned it all himself with his wife as his accomplice. But my son never knew that the old naval watch on my wrist was more than just a family heirloom. While he lurked in the shadows planning his father's death, every confession was recorded. I thought that island would be my grave, until a mysterious woman emerged from the mist with a bow in her hand, stared intently at my name, and said something that froze me in place. Thank you for being here with me. Before we dive in, leave a quick comment. Have you ever had to deal with someone close who betrayed your trust? Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Quick note, some details are fictionalized for storytelling. What matters most is the lesson at the heart of this story. The December wind cuts across Puget Sound like a blade. I sit on the deck of my 32-foot sailboat, alone, the water dark beneath me and the sky darker above. My name is Harvey Webb. I'm 65 years old. 6 months ago, my son tried to kill me on an island in Alaska. I'm going to tell you how I survived. Not the survival itself, that's the boring part. Cold hunger, sleeping in caves, all the things you'd expect from a man abandoned on frozen rock, 400 miles from civilization. The interesting part is what I did before my son left me there to die. The choices I made in the weeks and months leading up to that June night when he pushed me onto a beach and sailed away. Because I knew, not everything but enough. It started in June 6 months ago. My son Conrad walked into my corporate office on the 40th floor of 505th Avenue in downtown Seattle. He was carrying an expensive bottle of scotch and wearing a smile I hadn't seen in 3 years. Conrad Webb, 38 years old, vice president of the shipping corporation I'd built from nothing over 40 years. My only son. Dad, he said, setting the bottle on my desk, I want to take you on a trip. I looked at him. Really looked. He had my build from 30 years ago, 6 feet broad shoulders, the kind of frame that commands a deck in rough seas. His mother's eyes, though, dark and quick and always calculating. What kind of trip? I asked. Alaska, he said. Just the two of us. The yacht. No phones, no meetings, no corporate bullshit. I want to learn how to read ocean currents from you again, like when I was 8. The mention of 8 years old hit exactly where he intended. I remembered Conrad at that age sitting on my shoulders on the deck of our first ship, asking why the sky changed color before storms. I remembered being young enough to believe my son would grow up to be someone I recognized. When I asked, next week, 4 days, maybe 5, there's a cove near the panhandle I've been scouting. Perfect fishing. Perfect for just talking. I looked into my son's eyes and saw what I'd refused to see for 3 years. The warmth was performance. The smile was practice. He wanted something, and it wasn't to learn ocean currents. I said yes anyway. Not because I believed him, but because I wanted to be wrong. 3 days before the scheduled departure, I woke at 5 in the morning and went to my workshop behind the house. The workshop is where I keep the things that matter. Old maritime charts, my grandfather's sextant tools from my first captaincy 40 years ago, and my grandfather's watch. It's a marine chronometer. 40 years old, built in 1984 by a Swiss watchmaker who specialized in instruments for deep-sea vessels. My grandfather wore it when he crossed the Pacific in 1952. My father wore it when he captained freight routes to Japan. I wore it on every voyage until I became too important to go to sea. The watch sits in a leather case lined with felt. I opened the case and lifted it out, feeling the weight heavier than modern watches. Solid brass and steel, the face yellowed with age, but the mechanism still perfect. I'd upgraded it last October. Not the outside, Conrad would notice that. The inside. I'd taken it to a specialist in maritime electronics, a man who'd worked with me 20 years ago, outfitting navigation systems on cargo ships. He'd opened the back casing and installed an iridium satellite module the size of a thumbnail. The watch now did 2 things. It told time, and it recorded audio. Every 15 minutes, it automatically uploaded the recording to a secure server via satellite connection. The battery lasted 96 hours. The module was invisible unless you knew what to look for. I'd installed it after an uncomfortable meeting in October. A meeting where my son and my CFO had exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret. A meeting where the numbers they presented didn't match the reports I'd seen the week before. I didn't know what they were planning, but I knew enough to prepare. I was adjusting the watch's strap when Conrad walked into the workshop. I didn't hear him coming. He'd always moved quietly, even as a child. "Dead," he said from the doorway. "You're up early." I didn't turn around. Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd check the equipment before we leave. He walked closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne. Expensive. Too expensive for a vice president's salary, even a generous one. "You still keep that antique," he said, looking at the watch in my hands. "Your great-grandfather's," I said. "Crossed the Pacific with it." Conrad frowned. My son never examines old things closely. Not antique watches, not old boats, not 65-year-old fathers. He sees age and dismisses value. That blind spot would cost him everything. "Sentimental stuff," he said. "You should get a real GPS watch, something modern." "This is real enough," I said. He stayed another minute making small talk about the weather forecast for Alaska. I kept working on the watch, adjusting the satellite module's upload schedule, setting the recording to activate on voice detection. Conrad never looked closely. He saw an old man with an old watch fussing over old memories. He didn't see the trap I was setting. I slipped the watch into my jacket pocket after Conrad left, feeling its weight settle against my ribs. The satellite uplink indicator glowed faint green, active connected battery full. In 3 days, this watch would travel to an island off the Alaskan coast and record every word my son spoke in the darkness, and Conrad would never suspect until it was far too late. I woke in darkness so complete I thought I'd gone blind. Then the cold hit. Not winter cold, the cold that kills. 4 degrees Celsius, maybe less. My clothes were soaked through salt water, freezing against skin sand like broken glass beneath my cheek. I tried to sit up. The world tilted. My head felt stuffed with cotton. My mouth tasted like metal and chemicals. Bitter. Wrong. Wine. I remembered wine. Conrad had poured it on the yacht. 2 glasses of expensive red. We'd anchored in a cove off the Alaskan panhandle. He'd said something about celebrating father and son ocean currents, the trip we should have taken 20 years ago. I'd raised the glass, tasted something off, thought cheap vintage. I was wrong about that too. The anesthetic fog cleared. I pushed myself upright, every muscle screaming cold and stiffness. My hands were numb. My feet were numb. The wind cut through my wet jacket like I was wearing nothing. I looked around. Darkness. Water. Waves hitting rocks. No yacht lights. No lights except stars above sharp and clear, and too many the way stars look, hundreds of miles from any city. I reached for my phone. Gone. Jacket pockets empty. No emergency beacon. No knife. No lighter. I looked for my pack. No pack. The tent. The sleeping bag. Water bottles. Food containers. Marine radio. Satellite communicator. Maps. All gone. Everything stripped except my clothes, and I looked at my wrist. The watch was still there. My grandfather's marine chronometer, the one Conrad had dismissed as sentimental garbage 3 days ago in my workshop. He'd left it because he thought it was worthless. I pressed the crown. The screen lit faint blue. 2:14 in the morning. June 1st. The satellite uplink showed green. Recording. Uploading every 15 minutes to a server Conrad didn't know existed. I started to laugh. The sound came out broken in the frozen air. My son had drugged me, stripped everything that could keep me alive, carried me unconscious to this beach, and left me to die. And he'd left me the one thing that mattered. But that realization wouldn't keep me warm. I needed to count. 40 years at sea taught me one absolute truth. You don't survive storms by hoping rescue comes. You survive by counting what you have, what you need, how long, until the cold wins. What I had wet clothes to watch 40 years of knowledge from captaining ships through Arctic routes. What I needed warmth shelter, freshwater food. How long until the cold winds in 4-degree water, hypothermia, kills in 30 to 90 minutes. I wasn't in water, but my clothes were soaked. I was 65. The wind was constant. Maybe 6 hours until I couldn't think straight. Maybe 12 until I couldn't move. Maybe 24 until my heart stopped. I looked up. Found the North Star through muscle memory. 40 years of navigation don't leave you, even when you're dying. Oriented myself. The mainland would be east, maybe northeast. I stood. My legs shook but held. Walked toward where the tree line should be. Found it. Pine and spruce dense and dark. No path, no lights. No sounds except wind and water and breathing. My son drugged me. My son carried me here while I was unconscious. My son stripped everything that could save me. My son left me to die on this beach. I thought those words would feel like rage or grief or betrayal. They felt like cold, simple facts. I walked along the beach, arms wrapped around my chest, testing my legs, trying to generate heat. The sand gave way to rocks. The rocks gave way to cliff face too steep to climb in darkness. I turned back, walked the other direction. More beach, more rocks. The island was small. Very small, maybe a quarter-mile across. No lights anywhere on the water, no boat engines, no rescue. Conrad was already gone, back to Seattle, back to the corporation, back to whatever plan required my death to succeed. He thought he'd left me with nothing. He thought the old watch on my wrist was sentiment and nostalgia. He didn't know it was recording every sound, the waves, the wind, my breathing, and soon, if I survived long enough, it would record his voice again. Every word, every confession. But first I had to live through the night. I found a depression in the rocks above the tide line, sheltered slightly from wind. Stripped off my wet jacket, counterintuitive but wet fabric, pulls heat faster than no fabric. Wrung it out with numb fingers. Put it back on. Curled into a ball, arms around knees, conserving what heat my body could still generate. The watch ticked on my wrist. 2:47. In Seattle, Conrad was probably sleeping in his expensive apartment, dreaming about whatever he'd tell the board when I didn't return. Lost at sea. Tragic accident. His father loved the ocean, took the yacht out, alone, never came back. He'd mourn convincingly. He was good at that. I closed my eyes. Not to sleep. Sleep kills in cold, just to count. Count heartbeats. Count breaths. Count minutes until first light when I could see what I was working with. The watch recorded it all. Silence. Cold. The sound of a man refusing to die. First light broke over the Gulf of Alaska at 4:47, pale gray, spreading across black water. I'd been counting for 2 hours and 33 minutes. My hands were white. My lips were numb, but I was still conscious, still breathing. I stood up from the rocks, every joint protesting, and looked at what my son had left me with. The island was smaller than I'd thought, maybe 300 yards long, 100 wide. Rocky beach, dense pine forest cliffs on the north side. No buildings, no boats, no people. The mainland was visible to the northeast dark mountains against lighter sky. Maybe 5 miles away, maybe 10. Too far to swim, too far to signal. I looked down at the watch, still recording, still uploading, still counting the hours until Conrad discovered his first mistake. At 5:30 in the morning, with dawn fully broken over the Gulf of Alaska, I stood and began walking north along the rocky beach. Not in panic, not in despair, in the methodical pattern of a captain assessing a storm. 40 years at sea doesn't leave you. The cold was the same 4 degrees, maybe 5, now that the sun was up. My clothes were still damp, my hands were still white, but my mind had shifted from survival mode to assessment mode. There's a difference. Survival mode keeps you alive through the night. Assessment mode keeps you alive long enough to get off the island. I needed inventory, not of what I'd lost. That list was simple everything. Inventory of what I had, what this island could give me, what 40 years of maritime experience could extract from rock and water and pine forest. Survival priority order, same as I'd taught crews on Arctic routes: shelter water, food direction time. Shelter first. I looked inland. Dense pine forest started 20 yards from the high tide line, thick enough to block wind. Last night I'd sheltered in rocks because I couldn't see the forest. Tonight I'd need better. Pine boughs could make a lean-to if I could break enough branches with bare hands. Not comfortable, but alive. Water, second. I walked north along the beach, scanning the tree line for the telltale sign every captain learns in cold climates. Green moss, darker than the rest, clustered on north-facing rock. Found it 300 yards up the beach, a stream maybe 8 inches wide, cutting through the rocks, from inland forest down to the sea. I knelt beside it, cupped my hand, drank. Glacier fed, cold enough to hurt my teeth, clean. No sulfur smell, no mineral taste, just pure runoff from snowmelt higher up the island. I drank until my stomach cramped, then drank more. Dehydration kills faster than hunger. I'd gone 16 hours without water since Conrad drugged me. My body needed this more than warmth. Food third. I stood wiping my mouth and looked at the tidal rocks stretching into the water. Oysters. I could see them clustered on the rocks, exposed by low-tide Pacific oysters. Gray-blue shells the size of my palm. Further out, tidal pools held crabs, Small ones dunned nests, maybe, but protein. And kelp along the waterline, bull kelp, edible if you're desperate enough. I wasn't desperate yet, but I would be in 48 hours. Direction 4th. I turned, looking at the sun angle. Still low, still climbing. East-southeast. That put the mainland. I calculated wind patterns, current direction from last night's star positions. Distance from the yacht's last anchorage before Conrad drugged me. Southeast, maybe 120 miles. Too far to swim, too far to signal. But knowing the direction meant knowing which way to look for rescue if it came. Which it wouldn't. Not from Conrad. Time 5th, the most important calculation. I looked at the watch. 5:43 in the morning, June 1st. The satellite indicator still showed green, uploading every 15 minutes, battery at 87%. Conrad would have sailed back to Seattle last night. Arrived early morning. He'd wait 12 hours, maybe less, before declaring emergency. Father didn't return from solo fishing trip. Search and rescue protocols. Concerned son. The corporate bylaws had a 48-hour emergency clause. If the CEO was incapacitated or missing and couldn't be reached, the vice president could call emergency board meeting with 24 hours notice. Conrad would declare me missing by tonight. Call the meeting for June 3rd, maybe June 4th if he wanted to look appropriately grieving. 60 to 65 hours maximum before he stood in that boardroom and took everything I'd built over 40 years. I had to get off this island before that meeting. 40 years as captain teaches you to read water. Wind and sky, how storms build, where currents run when ice forms. But the first thing it teaches you is this: panic drowns you faster than the sea ever will. I walked back south along the beach, mentally cataloging what I'd found. Freshwater stream, check. Food sources, marginal but present. Shelter materials available. Direction to mainland known but irrelevant without a boat. Without a boat. That was the gap in every calculation. I could survive on this island for days, maybe weeks, if I was careful. But survival wasn't the goal. The goal was getting to Seattle before Conrad signed papers that couldn't be unsigned. And for that, I needed off this rock. I rounded the northern point of the island, heading back toward where I'd woken up. The beach here was different, less rocky, more sand. Smooth and gray and untouched except for my footprints from earlier. And something else. I stopped. There, 20 feet ahead, cutting across the sand from the tree line down to the water's edge, drag marks. Not my footprints, not driftwood. Drag marks, 2 parallel grooves in the sand about 3 feet apart, deep enough to show someone had hauled something heavy across the beach. A canoe. I walked closer, crouched down. The marks were fresh. The tide hadn't touched them. I could see the high tide line 10 feet below where the marks started. That meant they'd been made after high tide. I calculated high tide had been around 6 hours ago based on current water level. Someone had dragged a canoe across this beach within the last 12 hours. Maybe within the last 6. I followed the marks with my eyes. They led from the forest toward the water, then curved west toward the rocky promontory, where morning mist still clung to stones. Deliberate, purposeful, single person. The marks were too clean, too straight for multiple people struggling with weight. Someone strong enough to haul a canoe alone. The canoe marks were fresh. The tide hadn't erased them. Someone had been on this beach dragging a boat toward the west promontory within the last day, maybe within the last 12 hours. I looked toward the promontory. Fog obscured the rocks, made it impossible to see if the canoe was still there. If the person was still there, question wasn't whether someone else was on this island. Question was whether they'd help me survive or finish what Conrad started. I stared at the canoe drag marks in the sand and stopped breathing for 3 seconds, because I'd seen that canoe before. Heard it scraping rocks in the absolute silence of an Alaska night while my son wished me dead. The memory hit like cold water. Midnight, May 31st, bleeding into June 1st. 12 hours before I woke fully conscious on the beach. I'd woken too early. Conrad had miscalculated. The anesthetic dose he'd put in the wine was calibrated for normal metabolism office workers, desk executives, people who spent 40 years in boardrooms instead of on ship decks in Arctic weather. But 40 years at sea changes your body, changes how you process cold exhaustion chemicals. I came to impartial consciousness around 11:30 at night. Not fully awake, the drug still had me in fog but aware, hearing, thinking slowly through cotton-wrapped thoughts. I was lying on sand, cold, wet, couldn't feel my hands. Voices. Male and female arguing in harsh whispers, maybe 50 yards away, west, toward the rocky promontory. I forced my eyes open. Darkness, stars overhead. The drug made everything swim and tilt, but I could see silhouettes against the water. Two people struggling with something on the rocks. A canoe, stuck on the reef at low tide. I recognized my son's voice even through the anesthetic fog. The second voice took longer, higher precise, educated. Female. Beatrix. Beatrix Richter, 36 years old, Chief Financial Officer of Webb Shipping Corporation, Conrad's wife of 4 years. I'd promoted her myself 3 years ago. Smart, ruthless, with numbers perfect for the CFO role. I thought Conrad married well someone who understood the business, who could help him grow into leadership. I was wrong about that too. Push harder, Beatrix said, her voice carrying across the water in that strange way sound travels over ocean at night. We need to get this back to the yacht before someone sees. There's no one here, Conrad said. That's the whole fucking point. Then push. I should have stayed down, should have kept pretending unconsciousness. But something in me, some stupid dying hope that this was misunderstanding, that my son hadn't really drugged me and left me to die, made me move. I crawled, slow, elbows and knees. The anesthetic made coordination nearly impossible, but I managed 20 yards from the sand to the rocks without making sound. Hid behind a boulder maybe 30 feet from where they struggled with the canoe. And I listened. How long? Conrad asked. 48 hours until the emergency clause activates, Beatrix said. She wasn't struggling anymore, had given up on the canoe, and was standing on the reef, checking her phone. Board meeting June 3rd, 8 a.m. By then, he'll be bones on this beach, and no one will ever find him. And the search? You declare him missing tomorrow evening. Say he went fishing alone at dawn, never returned. Coast Guard does standard search. They won't find anything. We're 120 miles from the nearest patrol route. Conrad laughed. The sound echoed off rocks. Old man becomes prey to animals or dies of thirst out here. His outdated maritime thinking is worthless. The corporation belongs to us now, it always should have. There's a specific sound a father's heart makes when he hears his own son wish him dead. It doesn't shatter or break. It goes cold and absolutely silent, like a ship's engine cut in the middle of the ocean. No warning, just sudden empty quiet. I reached for my wrist. The watch was still there. Conrad had seen it on the yacht, dismissed it the same way he'd dismissed it in my workshop. Worthless antique. Sentimental garbage. I pressed the crown twice. The record function activated with one tiny beep, masked completely by the sound of the canoe scraping reef rocks. And I listened. They talked for 47 minutes. Not continuously, there were pauses while they struggled with the canoe. Long silences filled with grunting and cursing and the sound of aluminum on rock. But when they talked freely, because they thought I was unconscious on a beach dying of hypothermia, unable to hear anything ever again. They talked about the board meeting, how Beatrix had already prepared the emergency resolution documents, how Conrad would play the grieving son perfectly he'd been practicing, he said in the mirror. They talked about the 48-hour clause in the corporate bylaws that I'd written myself 20 years ago, never imagining my own son would use it to steal everything. They talked about how much the corporation was worth, 400 to 600 million, depending on asset valuation, and how they'd split it, not equally. Beatrix wanted more. They argued about that for 6 minutes. They talked about me like I was already dead, like I'd never been a person, just an obstacle. Outdated thinking. Worthless old man. Should have retired 10 years ago. And through it all, the watch recorded. I pressed record on that watch. One small button, one tiny beep, masked by the canoe scraping reef rocks. In 40 years as captain, I'd made 1,000 life or death decisions in seconds. This was the easiest I ever made. Every 15 minutes, the watch uploaded to satellite. Sent the audio file to secure servers Conrad didn't know existed. Backup after backup after backup. Evidence he had no idea was being created. Finally, around 12:45, they got the canoe free. Go, Beatrix said. I'll meet you at the yacht. We need to be 20 miles offshore by dawn. Conrad dragged the canoe toward the water, stopped, looked back toward where I'd been lying on the beach. Think he's dead yet? He asked. Beatrix checked her phone for weather. 4 degrees Celsius. Wet clothes. 65 years old. Give him 12 hours. Hypothermia will finish it. Good, Conrad said. They launched the canoe. paddled away into darkness toward where the yacht was anchored offshore. The sound of aluminum paddle on water faded slowly until there was nothing but waves and wind. I stayed behind the rocks for another 10 minutes, making sure they were gone, making sure the drug wouldn't pull me back under. Then I crawled back to the beach, back to where Conrad had left me, lay down in the sand in the same position, closed my eyes, and waited for dawn. The forgiving father died on those rocks, listening to his son plan his murder. What crawled back to that beach was something else, something cold, something that counted. The flashback dissolved. I was back in the present June morning, standing over the same canoe drag marks in the sand. The trap had closed around them the moment that canoe got stuck on the reef and Conrad started talking. They just didn't know it yet. The evidence existed. The trap was already closed. Conrad just didn't know it yet. I left the beach and walked inland through sparse Alaska pine, moving deliberately into the island's interior. Not running from what I knew about my son, hunting for what I didn't know yet. The forest was thin, not the dense coastal rainforest you find in most of Alaska, but scrubby pine and spruce, struggling in rocky soil. The ground climbed gradually from the beach, rising maybe 40 feet over 200 yards. Cold air smelled like sap and moss and something older. I moved carefully. My body was recovering from hypothermia, hands, still clumsy legs, still uncertain, but 40 years of walking ship decks in rough weather had taught me how to move when the ground wasn't stable. 200 yards inland I found the camp, or what was left of it. A clearing maybe 20 feet across, sheltered by pine on 3 sides. Cold fire pit in the center ashes, long dead, maybe months old. Scattered rocks arranged like someone had built a windbreak, and torn industrial tarp, blue and yellow, half buried under pine needles. I knelt beside the tarp, pulled it free. The logo was faded, but still visible. Webb Shipping Corporation, Geological Survey Division. My hand stopped moving. I brushed away more pine needles. Found a broken pencil. Yellow paint flaking off, but the stamp was clear. Property of WSC, GO Survey. The engineer. August 20th, 23. 9 months ago. Young guy, 28, fresh geology degree from University of Washington. Webb Shipping had hired him for coastal survey work, identifying potential deep-water port sites along the Alaska Panhandle. Standard corporate expansion research. He'd gone missing in August. Last contact was a satellite phone call saying he was extending his survey another 3 days. After that, nothing. Search and rescue found nothing. The Coast Guard searched for a week. I'd authorized company resources for a private search, spent nearly $200,000 looking. No evidence, no body, no gear, just gone. I'd signed the report closing the investigation myself. Ruled it accident at sea, presumed drowned. Body never recovered. 'Cause I'd been looking in the wrong ocean. I held that broken pencil in my palm for a long time. Geological Survey, Division 2023. Accident at sea. I'd signed the report closing that investigation myself. No evidence, no body ever recovered. Because I'd been looking in the wrong ocean the entire time. Conrad had killed him here. Brought him to this island, murdered him, left him to rot in the forest, or be carried away by animals. Then Conrad went back to Seattle, filed the missing person report, played the concerned executive. Let the search happen. Let it fail. And 9 months later, Conrad brought me to the same place. Not impulsive, not panic, not a son driven to desperate betrayal by greed or anger. Systematic, calculated, practiced. My son was a killer who'd done this before, who had a system, who had a dumping ground. I was victim number 2. I stood up slowly. The island felt different now, not just a place Conrad abandoned me to die, a place Conrad used, a tool. How many others? Just the engineer. And me. Or were there more camps I hadn't found, more pencils stamped with company logos? More people who became inconvenient? The cold in my chest had nothing to do with temperature anymore. I walked back toward the beach, different route, angling east instead of west. The sun was higher now, late morning, maybe noon. I needed food. The oysters on the tidal rocks. The east shore was different from where I'd woken up. Cliffs instead of beach, rising maybe 15 feet above the waterline. Tidal rocks at the base exposed by low tide, covered in oysters and mussels and kelp. I climbed down carefully, found a sharp rock, started prying oysters free. The first arrow hit the cliff face 2 centimeters from my left hand. I froze. Not a miss. Perfect accuracy. If the archer wanted me dead, I'd be dead. This was a warning. The second arrow hit 2 centimeters from my right hand. Same precision. Mirror image. I looked up. Elva Finch stood 30 feet above me in the tree line at the top of the cliff. 50 years old, maybe older, hard to tell with weathered faces. Gray hair pulled back. Traditional bow drawn third arrow. Nocked, aimed at my chest. She wasn't looking at my face. She was looking at my shirt. The Webb Shipping corporate polo I'd been wearing on the yacht. Faded now, torn stained with salt and dirt. But the logo was still visible on the left chest. The stylized ship's wheel. The letters WSC. And underneath, too small to read from 30 feet, but I knew it was there. Founded 1952. Roderick Vance. She said one word. Vance. Not a question. Not curiosity. Recognition. Like seeing a rattlesnake's pattern and knowing exactly what it means. The bow didn't waver. Elva Finch. I didn't know her name yet, but I knew what I was looking at. 50 years old, weathered face that had seen hard weather eyes, that didn't blink hands, that held that bow like it was part of her body. Traditional design wood and sinew, not compound fiberglass. The kind you build yourself. The kind you use when you live somewhere without stores. She emerged from the island's pine shadows with that drawn bow, expressionless, and the only thing she cared about, on my entire body, was the corporate logo still visible on my torn shirt. Vance, she said again. Flat, cold, like a name burned into memory 20 years ago and never forgotten. I understood 3 things in the space of one heartbeat. 1, she'd been watching me since I woke up on this island, maybe since the yacht anchored. Those canoe marks I'd found weren't old. They were hers. 2, she knew that name. Roderick Vance, my wife's father, Conrad's grandfather. The man who founded Webb Shipping 70 years ago and built it into an empire by doing things people didn't ask questions about. 3, whatever Roderick Vance had done to this woman or her family, it was bad enough that seeing his name on my chest made her draw a bow and aim for my heart. I had maybe 10 seconds to become something other than what that logo said I was. Or the third arrow would follow the first 2. I didn't wait for permission to speak. I started talking the second my brain reconnected to my mouth, because waiting meant the third arrow, and I had exactly one truth that might keep me breathing. My name is Harvey Webb, I said. My voice came out hoarse from cold and salt water. Vance Webb was my father-in-law. He's dead now. Died in 2018. I know what that name means to you. I know what happened in 2004. The bow didn't waver, but she didn't release either. I moved slowly, raised my left hand, the one farthest from the oyster knife I'd been using, showed her my palm empty, then brought it to my right hand and twisted the ring. Family ring, gold worn smooth by 40 years of wearing it. Engraved on the inside with dates I didn't need to read anymore. I knew them by heart. My wedding date. The date my son was born. The date I became CEO. I pulled it off, first time in 40 years. The skin underneath was pale and strange. I placed the ring on the rock in front of me. Not offering it. Not a bribe. Just acknowledgement. This is who I am. This is what I'm connected to. This is what I'm willing to set down to tell you truth. Spring 2004, I said. Oil spill in your tribal fishing waters. One of our ships hit a reef in a storm, leaked 11,000 gallons of bunker fuel before we could contain it. Emergency board meeting 48 hours later. 9 directors. I could still see that boardroom. Mahogany table. Leather chairs. My father-in-law, Roderick Vance, at the head of the table, 78 years old, and still commanding every room he entered. 8 directors voted to handle it quietly. I said, settle with the tribe directly. Minimal payout. No federal report to EPA. No public record. Business decision cheaper to pay quiet money than face federal investigation and fines. The wind picked up. Elva's gray hair moved, but her bow didn't. I voted no, I said. Only dissent. 9-1. I paused. Let that sink in. Then I testified in federal court against Vance Webb. Against my own father-in-law. Against the entire board. I told the EPA exactly what happened in that meeting. What the vote was. What we knew about the spill and when we knew it. What the board wanted to hide. I testified against my own father-in-law in federal court, Vance Webb. Empire founder, the man who'd given me my first ship to captain 20 years earlier. I stood in that courtroom and told the EPA exactly what the board voted to hide. I lost 2 years for that testimony. I thought I'd lose everything. Vance removed me from the board, I said. Punishment. 2 years. Kept me as captain, needed my maritime experience, couldn't fire me without admitting what I'd testified about was true. But removed from all corporate decisions. Told the family I'd betrayed them. The EPA investigation went forward, I continued. Federal fines, environmental remediation costs, and compensation to your tribe for destroyed fishing grounds. Total cost to Webb Shipping, $60 million over 5 years. I looked up at her. The bow was still drawn, but something had changed in her face. Not trust, but attention. She was listening. Conrad was 8 years old in 2004, I said. He grew up hearing that story. Hearing his grandfather Vance say I'd cost the family $60 million. Hearing the board members who supported the cover-up say I'd betrayed Webb legacy. Hearing his mother, my wife, say I'd chosen strangers over family. My throat was raw, but I kept talking. Conrad made a choice, I said. When he got old enough to understand what happened, he chose his grandfather's version of the story. Chose to see 2004 as betrayal, instead of what I thought, it was doing the right thing when it cost everything. I gestured at the island around us. He chose this island deliberately, I said. Not random, not just convenient dumping ground. This is tribal land, protected waters. The same waters where the 2004 spill happened, where your people lost fishing grounds for 5 years. Conrad knows every detail of 2004. Every vote, every word I spoke in that courtroom, every dollar. The family lost in fines and tribal compensation. $60 million total. That's why I'm here on this island in your tribal waters. He wants me to die on the exact land I saved. Ultimate revenge. My son drugged me, I said. Brought me here unconscious. Stripped everything that could keep me alive. Left me to die of hypothermia on this beach. He knew exactly what he was doing. This isn't the first time I found another man's camp inland. Webb Shipping geological survey gear, the engineer who went missing last year. Conrad killed him here too. I paused. Let the waves fill the silence for 3 heartbeats. But Conrad made a mistake, I said. He thought leaving me here to die was justice. Symmetry. Father who saved tribal lands dies on tribal lands where no one will ever find him. But he didn't know you were here. Didn't know the land he chose for my grave had a witness. I looked directly at Elva. I don't know your name, I said. I don't know your story. I don't know what Vance Webb's company did to you or your family beyond the oil spill. But I know that name makes you want to kill me. And I know I have one truth that might be worth not killing me. I gestured at the ring on the rock. I lost 2 years on that board for testifying in 2004, I said. Lost my wife's respect. Lost my father-in-law's trust. Lost the easy path where I could have voted yes and kept everything comfortable. And 20 years later, my son is trying to kill me, partly because of that choice. I stopped talking. My voice was gone, salt and cold in exhaustion. The cliff went silent except for waves hitting rock and wind in the pine trees above. Elva stared at the ring for 1 full minute, then 2. The bow stayed drawn, arrow still aimed at my chest. Then she spoke, same flat voice as before. Why don't you sell that ring? She asked. Money can buy more than honor. I looked at her face. This wasn't a question about price. This was a test. And I had about 5 seconds to understand what she was really asking. I looked at the family ring on the rock between us and understood what she was really asking. Not why I kept it, why I valued it. That ring is the only proof I have that I paid for the choice I made in 2004, I said. Vance gave it to me when I married his daughter. Gold, family crest, all the weight of Webb legacy in one piece of metal. I still wear it because it reminds me what it costs to be right instead of rich. Silence, waves, wind. Then Elva lowered the bow. Not all the way. Just enough that the arrow wasn't aimed at my heart anymore, aimed at the rocks below my feet. Follow, she said. She turned and walked up the cliff path. Didn't wait to see if I followed. Didn't look back. Elva, she said once, still moving, not turning. Her name, that was all. On this island, apparently, that was enough introduction. I picked up the ring, put it back on my finger. The metal was cold, and the fit felt strange after those 10 minutes without it. Then I followed. We walked for 15 minutes through pine forest in near darkness. The sun had set while I'd been talking twilight, fading fast into Alaska's summer night. Elva moved through the trees like she knew every root and stone by heart. I stumbled twice on terrain I couldn't see. She never slowed. The cave entrance was hidden behind a fallen spruce, barely visible even when I was standing 3 feet from it. Natural rock formation maybe 8 feet high at the opening, narrowing to a passage that led deeper into the island. Elva ducked inside, struck flint to kindling. Fire caught. The interior was bigger than the entrance suggested, maybe 15 feet, across ceiling high enough to stand. Long-term dwelling, organized, maintained, lived in. Furs stretched across flat rocks for sleeping, clay vessels for water, dried fish hanging from a rope strung between natural stone pillars, bundles of herbs tied and hanging near the fire pit where smoke would preserve them. She'd been here a long time. Elva gestured to a fur near the fire. I sat. My legs gave out halfway down, exhaustion and anesthetic residue and hypothermia damage all hitting at once. She moved efficiently, filled a clay vessel with water from a larger storage jar, crushed dried leaves between her palms, 3 different plants I didn't recognize, dropped them in the water, set the vessel at the fire's edge to heat. While the water heated, she skewered oysters on a green stick and held them over flames. The smell made my stomach clench. I hadn't eaten in over 24 hours. 5 minutes later, she handed me the vessel. The liquid inside was dark and steaming. "Drink," she said. "Anesthetic still in your blood. This cleanses." I drank. The herbal tea tasted like burning cedar and something older I couldn't name, traditional knowledge passed down through generations, while men like Vance Webb built empires on paper and called it to civilization. I drank every bitter drop because survival doesn't care about taste. The oysters came next, perfectly grilled hot enough to burn my tongue. I ate 6 of them before my hands stopped shaking. Elva sat across the fire and watched. Didn't eat, just watched me like a scientist observing an experiment. After the food and the tea warmth started returning to my core, the shaking stopped. My thoughts cleared. For the first time since waking on that beach, I felt almost human. "How long have you been on this island?" I asked. She didn't answer immediately. Threw another piece of driftwood on the fire. Sparks rose. 7 years, she said finally. "Year-round. Kayak to mainland twice per year for supplies I can't make or hunt." Not your question to ask." "Fair enough." We sat in silence for maybe 10 minutes. The fire crackled. Wind moved through the cave entrance. Somewhere outside, an owl called. Then Elva spoke again. "Your son sent someone to survey this island 8 months ago," she said. "Mineral resources, geological assessment. I saw him. The engineer you found." My hands stopped moving. I'd been warming them at the fire. "I didn't save him," she continued. Her voice was flat. No apology. No justification. "I watched him set up camp. Watched him work for 3 days. Watched your son's yacht arrive. Watched them argue. Watched Conrad hit him with a rock when the engineer said he'd report what he'd found. Deposits worth enough to bring industrial mining, destroy the island." She looked directly at me. "I didn't save him because I didn't know who he was then. Didn't know what he knew. Didn't know who sent him. Just another Webb Shipping employee on land that's been destroyed by Webb Shipping before. I let him die." She told me she'd watched the engineer die and hadn't saved him. No apology, no justification, just the truth, from someone who'd learned the hard cost of trusting too easily. I understood that. Some alliances form from necessity, not sentiment, and those are the only kind that last. "Now I know who you are," Elva said. "Webb, who testified against Vance. Webb, who lost 2 years for telling truth in federal court. Webb, whose son wants dead badly enough to bring him to same island where he killed before." She paused. "Common enemy," she said. Not a question, a statement. "Yes," I said. "How long until your son takes your company?" I looked at my watch. The satellite indicator still glowed green. Still recording. Still uploading. 52 hours, I said. "June 4th, 8 a.m. emergency board meeting. If I'm not there to stop him, he becomes CEO and controls everything." Elva nodded once. Threw another piece of wood on the fire. "Focus 52 hours from this island to Seattle mainland," she said. "Not enough for traditional sailing routes. Not enough for rescue signal and Coast Guard response. Not enough to build proper boat." She looked at me across the flames. "But enough to begin," I said. "Enough to begin," she agreed. We sat in silence. The fire burned. The wind howled. Somewhere outside in the darkness, the ocean kept moving, currents and tides and patterns I'd spent 40 years learning to read. But tomorrow I'd learn to read them a different way, the way Elva's people had read them for 200 years before Webb Shipping ever existed. Elva stood, gestured to the furs. "Rest now," she said. "Tomorrow we build." I lay down on furs that smelled like smoke and salt and survival. The watch ticked on my wrist. 52 hours. Enough to begin. Maybe enough to finish? The fire crackled and I closed my eyes for the first time since waking. On that frozen beach, finally warm, finally stable, finally with an ally who understood that trust is built from necessity and tested by time. Tomorrow we'd build a raft. Tonight I'd rest. And somewhere in Seattle, my son was sleeping thinking his father was already dead. At dawn on June 2nd, Elva stood at the west shore pointing to swirling water patterns I'd never learned to read in 40 years as captain. "Watch the water beneath," she said. I'd slept 6 hours in the cave, woken to cold oysters and more of that bitter herbal tea. My body still ached from hypothermia damage and the anesthetic, but my mind was clear. 50 hours remained until Conrad's board meeting. We had one day to build what we needed. Elva led me through pine forest to the western shore. Different from where I'd woken up, sandy beach instead of rocks, gradual slope into water instead of cliffs. The sunrise was just starting to break over the island behind us, throwing long shadows across the sand. She pointed at the water 15 yards offshore. "Watch the pattern, not surface beneath. The water below runs different, southeast toward mainland every 12 hours with tide." I looked. The surface showed normal tidal movement, waves rolling and foam kelp drifting. Standard Alaska coastal water. "I don't see it," I said. "Because you're watching wrong," she said. "Look at the kelp below surface. 6 feet down. See how it moves against the surface current." I stared harder, and then I saw it, subtle but there. The kelp near the surface drifted northeast with the visible current, but deeper kelp, just visible through the water, moved southeast at a different angle. 2 currents, one on top, one beneath. "This current," I said slowly, "it's not on any chart I've used in 40 years. "Your charts don't know everything," Elva said. "My grandmother's grandmother knew this water, taught my grandmother. My grandmother taught me. 200 years of knowledge while your people drew lines on maps and called them complete." She was right. 40 years as captain taught me to read charts, GPS, satellite current tables, modern precision down to the meter. But Elva was teaching me something no maritime academy ever documented knowledge, passed grandmother to granddaughter for 2 centuries, while men like me drew lines on maps and called them complete. "Light raft," Elva said. "Driftwood. Bamboo outrigger for stability. Balanced correctly, current does the work. 14 to 16 hours to mainland." "What's the tidal window?" I asked. "Opens 4 a.m. tomorrow," she said. "June 3rd, closes by 8. Miss that window, next one is 16 hours later, puts you past your deadline. Tomorrow at 4 in the morning, 32 hours from now." Elva turned and walked up the beach to where driftwood had piled against the tree line. Storm debris, sea-weathered light, but strong. She started selecting pieces. I joined her. We worked in silence, pulling driftwood from the pile, testing weight and density, discarding pieces that were too heavy or too rotten. By the time the sun was fully up, we had 20 pieces laid out on the sand. "Frame first," Elva said. She showed me the construction pattern. 2 long runners for the base, 8 feet each. Cross braces every 2 feet. Bamboo outrigger on the left side 3 feet out from the main hull, connected by strong cross poles. No nails, no rope, just vine. Elva demonstrated the spiral tying technique. Take the vine, she'd harvested it the day before, kept it soaking in salt water overnight to increase flexibility. Wrap it over the joint, under, around, through, back, over. Spiral pattern. Specific tension at each stage. Spiral pattern over, under tension here. She said, her hands moving fast. Vine tightens when wet. Stronger than your rope, doesn't split the wood like nails. I watched carefully, then tried it myself on the next joint. Too loose. Elva reached over, unwrapped it, showed me again. The 3rd attempt was better. The 5th was acceptable. By the 10th joint, I had the rhythm. We built the raft frame over 6 hours. She tied. I positioned. She adjusted tension. I calculated load distribution and center of gravity. 40 years of shipbuilding principles applied to 8 feet of driftwood and bamboo. "This vine tension enough for 2-meter waves?" I asked at one point. "Has been for 200 years, Elva said. "Good enough," I said. Later, testing the outrigger balance, I said, "This needs another foot for hull width and my weight." Elva nodded, adjusted without comment. We built that raft in near silence. No stories about our lives, no attempts at friendship through conversation, just hands working, competence, meeting, competence. Two people who'd learned the hard way that trust is built with work, not words. By afternoon, I trusted Elva's vine tying more than any welding I'd seen in 40 years. By 3 in the afternoon, the raft was complete. 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, 3-foot bamboo outrigger on the port side, total weight maybe 80 pounds, light enough for 2 people to carry, strong enough to hold a man across open ocean. We tested it, dragged it to the water, pushed it in. I climbed aboard, carefully distributed my weight, felt how it rode. The outrigger balanced perfectly. The vine joints held. The driftwood frame flexed slightly with the waves, but didn't crack. I climbed off. We pulled it back to shore, tied it to a tree above the high tide line. Ready for departure. 4 a.m. tomorrow, 30 hours from now. I looked at Elva. She stood beside the raft, expressionless as always. Have you crossed this current before? I asked. She looked at me for 3 seconds. Once, she said. Result? Her face didn't change. I'm standing here. That was all the guarantee I was getting. One woman's successful crossing on one previous raft. One data point. One survival. I nodded. It's enough, I said. We walked back to the cave as the sun dropped toward the western horizon. Tomorrow at 4 a.m. I'd climb onto that driftwood raft and trust 200 years of grandmother knowledge to carry me across 120 miles of Alaska Gulf. But tonight, while I slept in a cave and prepared for a dawn crossing built on indigenous wisdom and desperate calculation 120 miles south in Seattle, my son was accelerating his takeover. And the woman who helped him plan my murder was about to discover she'd never been his ally. Just another tool with an expiration date. One data point, one survival. It had to be enough. But while Elva and I bound driftwood with vine on June 2nd, I had no idea what was already moving in Seattle. Conrad had called an emergency board meeting at 6 that morning, a performance of grief precise enough to win 6 votes out of 9. By the time we tested the outrigger and declared the raft ready, he held temporary CEO control, effective the following morning, one signature away from 40 years of everything I had built. What he did not know was that the woman sitting beside him in that boardroom, the one who had helped him calculate my death down to the degree of temperature, had just discovered her own expiration date. By noon, Beatrix's support had transformed into something else. She told this to FBI investigators 3 days later, sat in an interview room and recounted every detail in that flat, professional voice. Noon on June 2nd. Their downtown apartment. Conrad meeting with attorneys about transition paperwork. Left his laptop home unlocked, something he never did. Beatrix needed quarterly projections, opened his laptop, clicked the folder. Inside screenshots. Dozens. Her text messages from March and April. The affair she'd thought secret. Every message documented. Beneath those divorce attorney correspondence. Draft papers. Asset division. Full custody of Nash to Conrad citing adultery and corporate espionage. Signing date, May 12th, 2024. 3 weeks before Alaska. Beatrix sat on the apartment floor for 40 minutes. Later she told FBI she spent that time calculating, not grieving the marriage, not feeling guilty about me dying on an island, calculating whether Conrad would use frame and discard or eliminate entirely. She decided she couldn't afford to wait to find out which. She stood, called her personal attorney first. Got a name. FBI Special Agent Theron Hardy, 42, who'd been building a case on Webb Shipping's suspicious financials for 3 months. Called Hardy at 12:47 p.m. I have information about corporate fraud, an attempted murder at Webb Shipping Corporation, she said. Professional. Controlled. My name is Beatrix Richter. I'm the CFO. I can provide island coordinates where they left him. Hardy asked 3 questions. Got 3 answers. Then, is Harvey Webb still alive? I don't know, Beatrix said honestly. But if he's alive, he'll come home on his own. Hardy hung up at 12:51 p.m., turned to his partner. Get Coast Guard on those coordinates. If Harvey Webb is alive and comes off that island, I want federal agents waiting at the dock. The case file that would eventually put Conrad away for life without parole started building that afternoon. Island coordinates from Beatrix. Anesthetic purchase records traced to veterinary supplier in Tacoma Beatrix's corporate credit card. $4 million in embezzled funds moved through offshore accounts. during the dates I was supposed to be on that Alaska trip. Timeline of conspiracy, documentary evidence, witness testimony from a scorned wife who'd chosen self-preservation over loyalty. The trap was closing around Conrad from two directions. From the island where I was building a driftwood raft with a woman who knew currents his charts would never show. From Seattle, where his own wife had just handed the FBI everything they needed. Conrad didn't know about either trap yet. Wouldn't know until too late. But as the sun set on June 2nd and I sat in that cave preparing for 4 a.m. departure, federal agents were already moving. Coast Guard vessels turning toward coordinates Conrad thought no one would ever find. And in 11 hours I'd climb onto a raft held together with vine and 200 years of grandmother knowledge and trust the ocean to carry me home. The trap was closing from two directions, island and Seattle. But I wouldn't know about Beatrix's FBI call or Coast Guard vessels for another 12 hours. Night falls on June 2nd, and for the first time in 48 hours, I have nothing to do. The raft is built. The plan is set. Departure is 6 hours away at 4 a.m. That makes this the most dangerous moment yet, because thinking is harder than surviving. Elva and I sit in the cave. The fire burns low. Outside, the raft waits at the water's edge, tied above the tide line. Everything is ready, which means I have 6 hours to do nothing but wait and think. Think about Conrad. Think about the board meeting in 32 hours. Think about my wife Lorraine, who's been dead 3 years but would have hated every choice I've made since the oil spill testimony. Think about climbing onto a driftwood raft at dawn and trusting 200 years of grandmother knowledge to carry me across open ocean. Elva breaks the silence. "What will you do with the corporation when you return?" she asks. I look at her across the fire. She's not asking out of curiosity. She's asking because she needs to know if saving me means saving something that will come back and destroy this island anyway. "I won't do anything," I say. "Put it in trust 6 months ago, January of this year. 80 million in personal assets, real estate accounts, investments, all of it transferred to an irrevocable trust. For your son, for my grandson," I say. "Nash, 4 years old. Can't touch the money until he's 25. Trustee is an independent lawyer named Farrah Greer. Not family, not corporate. Someone who can't be influenced by Conrad or the board." I pause, feed another piece of driftwood to the fire. "The child deserves a different choice than his father had," I say. "Different choice than I had. Money without the pressure. Time to figure out who he is before he has to figure out what to do with an empire. Your son gets nothing. Nothing from me," I say. "The corporate shares are protected separately. Shareholder agreements, right of first refusal clauses. Even with temporary CEO control, Conrad can't sell, transfer, or liquidate without board supermajority. He'll never get. Especially not after I walk into that meeting room alive." Elva nods slowly, persisting. "Before I tell you what Elva asked next, if you're still with me and you have assets with family, worrying about you in ways that feel wrong, trust that feeling. See a lawyer, you find yourself tell them everything. Note, what follows has adapted details for storytelling, but the lesson is real." "What about this island?" Elva asks. The question lands heavier than I expected. "What about it? Your son sent surveyors here," she says. 8 months ago, before the engineer you found. Mineral assessment. Lithium beneath the East Bay. High-grade deposits. Worth enough to bring industrial mining." I feel something cold settle in my chest. "If you don't return," Elva continues, her voice flat and factual, "Conrad signs mining contract within 6 months. I've seen the preliminary paperwork left behind after the engineer died. This island becomes an open pit within 2 years. Everything destroyed. The water, the fish, the land." She pauses, looks directly at me. "This island is the last land my tribe has," she says. "The rest was taken sold, flooded, poisoned by companies like yours. This is what remains. If you win your corporation back and do nothing, your victory means my people lose the last piece of land we have left." That question weighed more than any board vote I'd ever faced, more than any contract I'd signed in 40 years. Because Elva wasn't asking for promises, she was asking if I understood that winning meant more than just keeping my corporation. Silence, just the fire and the wind outside. I think about the 2004 oil spill testimony, the choice that cost me 2 years on the board, the choice Conrad hates me for, the choice I'd make again. I will deal with that before I enter the meeting room, I say. Elva stares at me for 10 seconds. How odd. Legal protection. I say, conservation easement, transfer ownership to Indigenous Land Trust, federal protection under Native American Graves Protection Act. Make it legally impossible for anyone, including me, including Conrad, including any future CEO, to exploit this land. Ever. Can you do that in one day? And I can make one phone call from the Coast Guard vessel, I say. Farrah Greer, the trustee. She'll have the paperwork filed before I walk into that boardroom. It'll be done. Elva nods once. No smile, no handshake, no thank you. Just one nod. Some commitments are made with contracts and signatures and lawyers in glass offices. Some are made in silence in a cave on an unnamed island between two people who've both paid too much for other people's greed. The second kind lasts longer. 4 a.m. Elva says. Tide window opens. I'll be ready, I say. She stands, adds one more piece of wood to the fire, then walks to her sleeping furs on the far side of the cave. I lie down on my own furs. The fire crackles. Outside waves hit the shore in steady rhythm. The watch on my wrist ticks battery at 73% satellite uplink. Still green, still recording, still uploading every sound to servers Conrad doesn't know exist. 6 hours until departure. 14 to 16 hours on that driftwood raft. Then Seattle. Then the boardroom. Then Conrad's face when he sees me walk through that door alive. But tonight, lying in this cave, I don't think about revenge. I don't think about the corporation or the board meeting or even my son. I think about an island whose name I don't know. I think about protecting land for a tribe I helped once 20 years ago with an oil spill testimony that cost me everything. I think about debts that matter more than empires. And I fall asleep 6 hours before climbing onto a raft that might kill me thinking that some promises are worth more than survival. I slept that night thinking about promises and islands and debts that matter more than empires. But 300 miles south, Beatrix sat alone in a dim Seattle cafe and dialed the FBI. I learned this later from FBI case files. Beatrix's testimony and surveillance records compiled over the next 72 hours. This is what happened while I slept. Evening, June 2nd, 8:30 p.m. Small cafe in Capitol Hill. Booths in back where conversations stay private. Beatrix arrived, first ordered coffee she wouldn't drink, sat facing the door. FBI Special Agent Theron Hardy arrived at 8:40. 15 years with the Bureau. 3 months building a financial crimes case on Webb Shipping that kept hitting dead ends, until Beatrix's call. He slid into the booth. No recorder visible, that would come later. This was assessment. You said you have information about attempted murder, Hardy said. I have coordinates, Beatrix said. Flat professional. He's on an island off the Alaska Panhandle, and he's not there by choice. She slid paper across the table. Handwritten. 57.2 degrees. North 135.4 degrees west. GPS coordinates, she said. Accurate to decimal points. Conrad had the yacht's navigation calculate exact location before we left him there. Hardy didn't touch the paper. How do you know he's not there by choice? Because I watched Conrad drug him, Beatrix said. Wine on the yacht. Anesthetic. Harvey unconscious within 20 minutes. We anchored offshore-used canoe to row him to beach. Stripped all his gear tent food, water radio beacon. Left him with clothes and an old watch Conrad thought was worthless. Hardy's pen moved. The anesthetic. We're from veterinary supplier in Tacoma, Beatrix said. Conrad used my corporate credit card, forged my authorization. I didn't know until I found the receipt this afternoon. Theron Hardy's pen stopped mid-note. When Beatrix mentioned the veterinary supplier, first hard evidence linking medical-grade sedation to corporate fraud. He looked up. Why tell me now you were complicit? You could go to prison. Because Conrad's going to kill me next, Beatrix said. Simple. Factual. Found divorce papers on his laptop today, dated 3 weeks before Alaska. Screenshots of my messages, adultery, evidence crimes he says I committed alone. He's been building my frame since March while I thought we were partners. She took a sip of cold coffee. If I testify, I need protection, she said. Conrad doesn't leave loose ends. And I'm a loose end. Hardy studied her. What else can you provide? $4 million in embezzled funds, Beatrix said. Moved through offshore accounts during the dates Harvey was on that island. Wire transfer timestamps, account numbers routing. Conrad thought I was helping hide it. I was documenting every transaction. She pulled the thumb drive from her purse, set it on the table. "Everything's there," she said. "Coordinates, anesthetic receipt, embezzlement trail, timeline, Conrad's communications about the plan." Hardy picked up the drive. "If Harvey Webb is alive, he'll need medical attention. I'm calling Coast Guard tonight." "Do it," Beatrix said. "But understand, if Harvey's alive and comes back, I'm the prosecution's star witness. If he's dead, I'm an accomplice to murder. Either way, I'm choosing survival." Hardy left at 9:15 with enough evidence to build a case ending in life sentences. Beatrix sat in that booth 20 more minutes, then drove home to the apartment she shared with Conrad, prepared to act like nothing changed. But Conrad already knew something was wrong. Late night, June 2nd, 11:30 p.m. 40th floor offices. Conrad sat alone in what was temporarily his office mine, the one he'd occupied 18 hours since that morning's emergency vote. Seattle skyline dark beyond windows. Beatrix had been distant at dinner, cold, answering questions but not meeting his eyes. Said she was tired. Said stress of Harvey missing was affecting her. But Conrad knew performance. He was an expert. He pulled out his phone, called the corporate attorney, woke him up. "Move the board meeting to tomorrow morning," Conrad said. 8 a.m. sharp. The lawyer's voice was groggy. "We scheduled it for June 3rd. That gives everyone time to—" "I don't care," Conrad cut him off. "Move it to June 4th, 8 a.m. Call everyone. I don't care if Gerald's flying in from Boston. Tell him to charter a red-eye. 8 a.m. June 4th emergency CEO confirmation." "Conrad, what's wrong?" "The longer we wait, the more time he has to cause problems," Conrad said. He meant me. The possibility, however unlikely, that I was still alive and might return. But the truth was, he felt something shifting. Beatrix's coldness. The way she'd looked at him calculating something. Speed was his advantage. Get the CEO vote done, get papers signed, make it legally binding before anyone could question. The lawyer agreed, said he'd make the calls. Conrad hung up at 11:53. Conrad's hand hovered over the phone after hanging up with the lawyer's Seattle skyline dark beyond the windows. He felt control slipping, but didn't yet know why. He sat there another hour, alone, thinking about timeline acceleration, thinking about his father 400 miles north, probably dead from exposure, thinking about how close he was to taking everything. What he didn't know, FBI Special Agent Theron Hardy was already building the arrest warrant. What he didn't know, Beatrix had turned witness, with enough evidence for 3 federal charges. What he didn't know, Coast Guard vessels were turning toward coordinates 57.2 degrees north, 135.4 degrees west. And what he definitely didn't know, I was sleeping in a cave on that island alive, preparing to leave at dawn on a driftwood raft that would deliver me to Seattle with hours to spare. By midnight on June 2nd, 2 clocks were ticking toward the same moment from opposite sides of the law. I slept on fur pelts 400 miles north, unaware that in 36 hours my son would face the board, and federal agents would be ready to move. The race had begun. The race had begun at midnight, but I didn't know that yet. 4 hours before sunrise, I dragged the raft through darkness toward invisible waves. Elva walked beside me, silent as always. We'd woken at 3:30, no alarm needed. Bodies trained by years of rising before light. She'd handed me dried fish and water. I'd eaten standing up, watching fog roll in from the west through the cave entrance. Perfect departure weather. The fog would hide me from any Coast Guard search that might already be underway. And if Conrad had sent someone back to verify I was dead, the fog would hide me from them too. We carried the raft between us. 80 pounds of driftwood and bamboo and vine light, but awkward across rocks in pre-dawn darkness. My hands were still recovering from hypothermia damage. Elva's grip stayed steady. The west shore beach was invisible until we were standing on it. Fog so thick I could barely see Elva 3 feet away. The sound of waves somewhere ahead. The smell of salt and kelp and cold ocean. We set the raft down at the tide line. The water was pulling out perfect timing for the southeast current Elva had shown me. 4:15 in the morning, exactly when she'd said the window would open. I stood there for a moment, looking at the raft. Driftwood held together with saltwater vine. Bamboo outrigger, no motor, no sail. Just wood and current and 200 years of grandmother knowledge. And I realized I'd never asked her the question that should have been first. "How long have you known I've been here?" I asked. Elva didn't hesitate. "Since the yacht anchored offshore first night, I saw them bring you ashore." I turned to look at her. Her face was barely visible in the fog and darkness. "You saw Conrad drug me, saw them leave me on the beach." "Yes," she said. "Simple, factual." "Why didn't you intervene sooner?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment, then because I trusted the Vance family once. "This time I needed to know who you were before deciding." The answer hit me harder than I expected. Not anger, not betrayal, something else. "You let me suffer 2 days to test whether I was worth saving," I said. Elva nodded. "I watched how you moved, how you assessed resources, whether you panicked or calculated, whether you tried to exploit what you found or respected it. I needed to know if you were Vance's heir or something different." She paused. "The camp you found," she continued. "The engineer from last year. I watched him too, for 3 days. Decided he was just another corporate employee sent to destroy the land. I let your son kill him because I didn't know what he knew or who sent him. I was wrong." Her voice didn't change. No apology, no regret, just facts. "But she said, "I watched you find that camp. Watched your face when you realized what had happened. Watched you connect the engineer's death to your own situation. You weren't surprised your son had killed before. You were calculating how to survive long enough to stop him from killing again." Her answer didn't anger me, it made me respect her more. 2 days of testing," I said. 2 days to decide if saving you would bring another Vance back to destroy what's left," Elva said. "Or if you were actually different. The 2004 testimony suggested different. But words are easy. Actions matter." We stood in silence, fog swirling around us, waves pulling at the raft. "Did I pass?" I asked. Elva looked at the raft, at the provisions she'd helped me pack, at the knife she'd given me from her own supplies. "You're leaving on a raft I helped you build," she said. "That's your answer." I nodded. "Fair enough." We pulled the raft to the water's edge. The tide was pulling strong. I could feel the current even standing on shore. Southeast, toward the mainland, toward Seattle, toward Conrad. I climbed aboard carefully. The raft rocked, but held stable. The outrigger balanced perfectly. I settled into position-centered weight, distributed paddle ready. Elva stood in the shallow water, one hand on the raft's edge. "Current will take you southeast for the first hour," she said. "Don't fight it. Let it carry you. Around hour 3, angle more east. By hour 8, you'll see the mainland. Last 6 hours are the hardest, you'll be exhausted. But that's when you need to paddle strongest." "Understood," I said. "About 14 to 16 hours total," she continued. "If you're not on shore by 8 tonight, you miss the window, and the current will push you north into open ocean. Don't miss the window." "I won't," I said. She looked at me one more time. Her face was weathered, unreadable. 50 years of surviving alone on an island, trusting no one, burned too many times. By people who wore corporate logos and made promises they didn't keep. "Thank you, Elva," I said, "for everything." She nodded once. "Just get there alive." Then she pushed the raft hard, launching me into black water. The current caught me immediately, pulled me away from shore, pulled me southeast into fog so thick I couldn't see my own hands on the paddle. I looked back once, saw Elva standing in the surf, already fading into gray. Then fog swallowed her completely. The island swallowed itself in gray within heartbeats, as if it had never existed. Within 30 seconds, everything was gone. Elva, the cave, the beach, the trees, the past 5 days erased by fog and current and distance. Only black water, invisible current. The sound of my paddle entering ocean, the smell of salt, and 14 hours of paddling ahead. I checked the watch. 4:23 in the morning, June 3rd. 30 hours and 37 minutes until Conrad's board meeting on June 4th at 8 a.m. Enough time. If the raft held, if the current worked, if I survived. What I didn't know, FBI Special Agent Theron Hardy was already on a plane to Seattle with an arrest warrant. What I didn't know, Beatrix was in witness protection preparing testimony. What I didn't know, Coast Guard vessels were searching coordinates I'd already left behind. What I didn't know, Conrad was awake in Seattle preparing for a board meeting that would never happen the way he imagined. 2 timelines converging toward the same moment. June 4th, 8 a.m. One from the ocean, one from federal law. Both aimed at the same target. I paddled into fog and darkness alone for the first time in 5 days, heading toward a son who thought I was already dead. The island vanished in fog. I paddled alone into darkness, unaware that timelines were converging. The current took me southeast for the first hour, exactly as Elva promised. I felt it immediately different from paddling against resistance. The raft moved with purpose, pulled by water, flowing 6 feet below the surface. Invisible. Undocumented on any chart I'd used in 40 years. But real. I didn't fight it. Let the current do the work. Kept the paddle ready for corrections, but mostly I just rode. 4:30 in the morning. Fog so thick I couldn't see past the raft's edge. Cold, not hypothermia. Cold like the first night, but the steady cold that wears you down over hours. I was wearing the same clothes I'd woken up in 5 days ago. Salt-crusted, torn, but dry enough. 30 hours and 26 minutes until Conrad's board meeting. I didn't need to check the watch to know. The number had been running in my head since I pushed off the beach. The fog started lifting around 5:30. Not disappearing, just thinning enough that I could see maybe 50 yards. Gray water, gray sky, no horizon line, just gradations of gray. And silence. Not the silence of the island. That silence had boundaries, trees, cliffs, cave walls. You could hear wind moving through pine, waves hitting specific rocks, your own footsteps on sand. This silence was different. Ocean silence is the whole world. No boundaries, no edges. Just water in every direction and the sound of your paddle breaking surface and your own breathing. Complete isolation for the first time. On the island I'd been alone but surrounded. Here I was, alone in the mathematical sense, the only point of reference in 360 degrees of empty. I paddled. Adjusted angle slightly east around 6 o'clock, the way Elva had instructed. Watched the sun rise somewhere behind the clouds, couldn't see it. Just noticed the gray getting lighter. 7 in the morning. My shoulders were burning, hands cramping. The paddle was crude driftwood, shaped roughly, for function, not comfort. Every stroke scraped skin. And then I saw it. Small bright spot on the horizon. Due southeast. Not sun wrong angle. Not waves too steady. Something else. I stopped paddling, stared at it, wondered if hypothermia or exhaustion was creating hallucinations. The spot didn't move, didn't fade. I started paddling faster. How many times can a 65-year-old body pull oars before the arms simply refuse? I was about to find out. 7 to 8, 8 to 9, 9 to 10. The hours blurred together. Paddle. Adjust angle. Paddle. Rest 30 seconds. Paddle again. The bright spot grew. Slowly. So slowly I couldn't tell if it was real growth or wishful thinking. Around 10 o'clock the fog cleared completely. Blue sky, sun, waves visible for miles, and the mainland dark line of mountains to the southeast maybe 60 miles away. The bright spot was between me and the mainland, getting larger. 11 o'clock. My hands were bleeding. Blisters from the paddle had opened then torn. Salt water in the wounds. Every stroke hurt. I kept paddling. Noon. The sun was directly overhead, hot now instead of cold. I'd gone from hypothermia risk to dehydration risk. Elva had packed water in a seal bladder container. I drank sparingly 2 sips per hour. Not enough, but had to last. The spot was definitely growing. Not a hallucination, something real. 1 o'clock, 2, 3. My body was failing in the systematic way bodies fail after prolonged stress. Shoulders cramping, back seizing, hands barely able to grip. 65 years old, 40 years of maritime experience. None of it prepared me for this, but the spot kept growing. 4 o'clock, I could make out details now. White, angular, moving. A ship. 5 o'clock, definitely a ship. Coast Guard cutter, I recognized the profile. They were heading southeast perpendicular to my course. If they didn't see me, they'd pass within a mile and never know I was here. I stopped paddling, stood up carefully on the raft, balanced on shaking legs. Waved both arms above my head. The vessel didn't change course. I kept waving. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. My arms were screaming, my legs shaking, the raft rocking. And then the vessel turned. Sharp angle change, directly toward me. They'd seen me. I sat down hard on the raft, breathing like I'd run a marathon. Watched them close the distance. 500 yards, 300, 100. 6:15 p.m. The Coast Guard cutter cut engines 50 yards from my raft. Searchlight swept across the water, despite the sun still being up procedure. I recognized it. The light hit me and held. Officers moved on deck, competent, urgent, professional. One was already on the radio. I could see him talking, gesturing. They knew protocol for man overboard recovery, for cold water rescue, for medical emergency. When the searchlight swept across the water, I finally believed I might survive this. They launched a small boat. 2 officers. It crossed the distance in 30 seconds, pulled alongside my raft. Harvey Webb, one of them shouted. I stared at him. They knew my name. Before I'd identified myself, before I'd said a word, someone had reported me missing. Someone had called them. Someone had given them coordinates. Yes, I said. My voice was hoarse from salt and dehydration and 14 hours of silence. Harvey Webb. Sir, we're going to bring you aboard, the officer said. Can you stand? I could. Barely. They helped me from the raft into their boat. Left the driftwood raft floating. Evidence, they said. Crime scene. Crime scene. That meant someone had told them this wasn't an accident. Told them I'd been left here deliberately. Told them to search. But who? They brought me alongside the cutter. More hands reaching down. Pulled me up to the deck. Wrapped a thermal blanket around my shoulders. Someone was taking my vitals. Someone else was asking questions, name, age, medical conditions, how long in the water. I answered on autopilot. My eyes were scanning the deck, the officers trying to understand. Who called you? I asked. Who reported me missing? The officer taking my blood pressure looked at me, then at his partner. Some unspoken communication. FBI coordinated the search, sir, he said. We'll explain everything once we get you warm and stable. But you're safe now. You're going home. FBI, not Conrad, not corporate, FBI, which meant someone had turned witness. I sat on that deck wrapped in thermal blankets, salt-crusted and bleeding and exhausted, and realized the trap I'd set was bigger than I'd known. They pulled me onto the Coast Guard deck at 6:12 p.m. on June 3rd. I know the time because the first thing I did after my boots hit steel was check my watch. 2 days, 14 hours, 47 minutes since Conrad left me on that island. I didn't collapse. I didn't vomit. I sat upright on a storage crate salt-crusted jacket, stiff against my shoulders, and looked at the young officer staring at me like I'd risen from the grave. Sir, he said, we need to get you below deck. Medical evaluation, warm fluids, and... What time is it? He blinked. 6:12 p.m., sir, but you need... Good. I checked my watch again, the leather strap dark with seawater, the face scratched, but functional. I need clean clothes, a phone, and a car waiting at Seattle Port. I have a meeting at 505th Avenue tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. The officer, I'd learned his name, was Lieutenant Dalton Perry. 34 years old, 12 years with the Coast Guard bronze hair already receding at the temples, stood frozen with a thermal blanket in his hands. Mr. Webb, he said slowly, you've been missing for 2 days. You were reported abandoned on an uninhabited island. We found your raft drifting 14 miles offshore. You need medical attention, not a... I need a car. I stood leg steady despite the raft journey, despite the dehydration, despite everything. Clean clothes first, then a phone. Don't call my family. Don't call my company. Call the FBI. Agent Theron Hardy. Tell him Harvey Webb is alive and needs transport to Seattle by 9 p.m. tonight. Perry's mouth opened-closed. Behind him, 2 other crew members watched with identical expressions of disbelief. Sir, the nearest hospital is... Later. I met his eyes, and whatever he saw there made him step back. Hospital later. Car first. FBI only. Those are my instructions, Lieutenant. He looked at me, 65 years old. Salt-dried clothes, hanging stiff hair matted with ocean spray hands, rope burned from paddling, and I saw the moment he understood. This wasn't a rescue. This was a pickup. Yes, sir, he said quietly. I'll make the call. 65 years old, 14 hours at sea, and I still sat like I owned the room, because I did. They gave me clean clothes from the officers' quarters, navy blue pants, white shirt jacket that almost fit. I washed my face in a steel sink hands, shaking for the first time, and stared at my reflection. 2 days of beard growth, sunburn across my cheekbones, eyes that looked 10 years older, but alive. I dried my watch carefully, checking the tiny recording indicator. Still there. Still secure. 47 minutes and 23 seconds of audio uploaded the moment we hit satellite range yesterday morning. Conrad's voice admitting everything. At 9 p.m., exactly, the FBI car was waiting at Seattle Port when the Coast Guard vessel docked. Agent Theron Hardy stood beside a black sedan, same rumpled suit I remembered from our company's fraud investigation 3 years ago, same sharp eyes that missed nothing. Mr. Webb, he opened the rear door. Get in. No pleasantries, no questions about my health. I liked him more for it. Inside the car, he handed me a bottle of water and a folder. Beatrix Richter gave her statement yesterday. Full confession: the Prudhoe Bay fraud, the money laundering through Webb Maritime Holdings, the plan to strand you. She provided coordinates, financial records, everything. We have enough for arrest warrants. I drank half the water bottle before responding. The board meeting, rescheduled to 8 a.m. tomorrow. Your secretary, Farrah Greer, followed your instructions. Sent us the sealed file 48 hours after your disappearance. The evidence you compiled over the past 6 months gave us everything we needed. Hardy glanced at me in the rearview mirror. Conrad doesn't know you're alive yet. Beatrix hasn't told him. We can arrest him tonight, or we can wait until tomorrow morning. Your choice. I looked out the window at Seattle's lights reflecting off Elliott Bay. Somewhere across the city, Conrad was sleeping in his Capitol Hill townhouse, dreaming of his 8 a.m. coronation. Tomorrow, I said. At the meeting, I want to see his face. Hardy nodded slowly. There's one thing Beatrix's testimony didn't cover. She said Conrad flew you to the island, but she wasn't there for the conversation. We have circumstantial evidence of abandonment, but no direct proof of intent. A good defense attorney could argue mechanical failure, emergency landing. Conrad planning to return, but I have the conversation. Silence. What Hardy's eyes met mine in the mirror. I held up my wrist, showing him the antique watch leather strap, salt-stained and cracking silver case scratched, but the tiny modified recording mechanism still visible if you knew where to look. 47 minutes, 23 seconds, I said quietly. From the moment we landed until the moment he flew away. Every word. You'll die here and I'll run the company you built. Direct quote. Recorded. Uploaded to a secure server the moment we hit satellite range. Agent Hardy looked at my salt-stained watch, then at me, and said nothing. The car moved through Seattle traffic, past Pike Place Market, past the waterfront where Webb Shipping's offices stood dark. Hardy's phone buzzed twice, but he ignored it. Finally, he spoke. The audio is admissible. Single-party consent state. I was party to the conversation. It's legal. I finished the water. I've been recording board meetings for 40 years, Agent Hardy. This was just another meeting. Jesus, he exhaled slowly. Does Conrad know about the watch? He never asked. I touched the scratched crystal face. Old men and their old watches. He stopped noticing years ago. At 9:30 p.m., the FBI car pulled into downtown Seattle 11 hours before Conrad's board meeting. Theron Hardy had arrest warrants, Beatrix's testimony, and 47 minutes of audio confession. I closed my eyes for the first time in 20 hours. The hotel room was clean, warm, and utterly silent, the first safety I'd felt in 6 days. Agent Hardy had dropped me at the Fairmont at 10:15 p.m., handed me a keycard and a phone charger, and told me he'd be back at 7:30 a.m. No guards, no surveillance, just a room on the 18th floor with white sheets and blackout curtains, and the kind of quiet that made my ears ring. I stood at the window for 20 minutes watching Seattle's lights blur through salt-scratched eyes. Somewhere across the city, Conrad was sleeping. Tomorrow at 8 a.m., he'd walk into that boardroom expecting coronation. Instead, he'd find me. I showered at 11 p.m., letting hotel water wash away 2 days of ocean salt and island dirt. The cuts on my hands from rope paddling stung under the spray. Elva's survival lessons had kept me alive, the raft building, the tide reading, the patience to wait for rescue instead of dying trying to swim. I owed her my life, and I'd make sure the FBI knew it when they went looking for her statement. By midnight, I was in bed, clean and warm and exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come. The room was too quiet. No wind, no waves, no crackling fire or Elva's stories about her grandfather's fishing routes. Just hotel silence and the distant sound of ship horns from Elliott Bay. I lay there in the dark thinking about Conrad. 8 years old, standing at the office window, asking why the sky changed color before storms. Why does it turn green, Dad? Why not red or purple? His face pressed to the glass breath, fogging the view of Puget Sound. I'd been on a phone call, some emergency with a delayed shipment, some crisis that seemed vital. Then and meaningless now. I'd put my hand over the receiver and said, "Light refraction, son. Ask your mother." He'd nodded and walked away, and I'd gone back to my call. When did that boy become the man who drugged me and left me to die on an island? I searched my memory for the moment. The conversation, the betrayal that turned him. There had to be a pivot point, a breaking clear before and after. But I couldn't find it. Instead, I found 20 years of small moments. A school play I missed because of a board meeting in Vancouver. his college graduation where I stayed for the ceremony, but left before dinner because of an acquisition deadline. The day he joined the company and asked to work on the Alaska expansion, and I'd said, "Start in operations first. Learn the real business." His face eager, then careful, then blank. 1,000 tiny abandonments, each one justified, each one necessary. Each one building toward the moment he stood on that island and said, "You'll die here, and I'll run the company you built." Not one moment. 20 years of moments I chose not to see. When does a father lose his son in one conversation or 1,000 silences? At 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and sat by the window watching Seattle's skyline. My watch sat on the nightstand leather strap, cracked and salt-stained, the tiny recording mechanism still visible in the lamplight. 47 minutes and 23 seconds. Every word Conrad said. Uploaded to FBI servers the moment we hit satellite range on June 2nd. Evidence. But also my son's voice preserved forever, saying he wanted me dead. I thought about Beatrix in FBI protection, somewhere giving her testimony. She'd loved Conrad once, maybe still did, in whatever broken way survives betrayal. Had she seen the moments I'd missed? Had she watched him transform and tried to warn him, save him, stop him? Or had she just helped him plan my murder and taken her 30 pieces of silver? At 5 a.m., I dressed in the clothes Agent Hardy had left a borrowed FBI suit. Navy blue, one size too large, smelling faintly of someone else's laundry detergent. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and barely recognized myself. Not the billionaire in tailored wool, not the ship captain in weather-beaten gear. Just a 65-year-old man in an ill-fitting suit about to walk into a room and destroy his son. The face in the mirror looked tired, old, but not uncertain. I'd known since January. 6 months of watching Conrad tracking his meetings with Beatrix, documenting the Prudhoe Bay fraud, compiling evidence. I'd known and I'd let it play out because I needed to see how far he'd go. Needed to know if the boy who asked about green storm skies was gone completely, or if some part of him might stop before the final betrayal. He hadn't stopped. At 7:30 a.m., Agent Hardy knocked on my door. Same rumpled suit, same sharp eyes, 2 cups of coffee in a cardboard carrier. "Breakfast," he said, handing me one. Black, no sugar, he'd remembered from the car ride. I drank it standing by the window. It tasted like burnt office coffee, familiar and bitter, and exactly what I needed. "The arrest team is in position," Hardy said. "We'll let you enter. First, let Conrad see you. Let him react. Once he confirms he thought you were dead, we move in. Simple. Simple. My son's arrest. My son's life ending in handcuffs and arraignment in federal prison. Simple." At 7:50 a.m., we rode the elevator to the 40th floor in silence. Hardy checked his phone. I checked my watch, not the time, but the mechanism, the proof, the recording that would send Conrad away for 20 years. The hallway outside the boardroom was empty, carpeted in charcoal gray, smelling faintly of coffee and furniture polish. Through the frosted glass door, I could see shapes moving Conrad, the board members, Beatrix's empty chair. Hardy stopped 10 feet from the door. "Ready?" I looked down at my wrist, at the salt-stained watch, at the scratched crystal face. Not checking time. Just touching it the way a sailor touches a compass before a storm. The borrowed suit hung wrong, but I had worn stranger armor into battle. I adjusted the too long cuff. "Ready since January of this year." Hardy's eyes widened slightly, understanding in that moment that this wasn't reactive survival, but calculated preparation that I'd known for 5 months, and let Conrad believe he was winning. Let him commit every crime record, every confession walk, every step toward his own destruction. 7:56 a.m., 4 minutes before the meeting. I crossed the hallway and put my hand on the door. My hand pushed the boardroom door at 7:56 a.m. June 4th. Inside waited Conrad, 4 board members, Beatrix's empty chair, and 47 minutes of audio evidence uploaded to FBI servers 3 hours earlier. The door swung open. The boardroom doors opened at 8 o'clock sharp, and Conrad's pen froze above the signature line. I walked in first. Behind me came 6 federal officers, 4 FBI agents, including Theron Hardy, 2 Coast Guard, including Lieutenant Dalton Perry, all in uniform, all silent. The timing wasn't accidental. Hardy had coordinated it perfectly, my entrance at the exact moment Conrad's pen touched paper, the exact second he committed the final act of corporate theft. Conrad's hand stopped mid-signature. The pen hovered over the line marked Conrad Webb acting CEO for 3 seconds 4-5. Then it fell to the mahogany table. The sound was small. Everyone in the room heard it. I wore a borrowed FBI suit, one size too large navy blue, instead of my usual charcoal gray. My hair was still salt-streaked from 2 days of ocean wind. I hadn't shaved. I looked like exactly what I was, a 65-year-old man who'd been abandoned on an Alaskan island and survived. I walked the length of the boardroom without hurry, past Gerald Ashford, who half rose from his chair and then sat down again, past Miles Sherwood, whose coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth, past Lauren Blackwell, whose expression went from confusion to recognition to something like horror in the space of 5 steps, past Beatrix Richter's empty chair, past my son, who stared at me like I'd risen from the grave, which I supposed I had. I reached the chairman's seat at the far end of the table. The leather chair I'd sat in for 40 years, the one Conrad had planned to claim in approximately 30 seconds, and I sat down. Coming home after a long journey, the silence lasted 10 seconds. 15, 20. The morning sun came through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting light across the polished table, across the unsigned transfer documents, across Conrad's frozen face. Gerald Ashford found his voice. First, Harvey. 62 years old, 23 years on the board, silver hair, perfectly trimmed, still sharp enough to see the federal uniforms and understand what they meant. What's going on? I didn't answer. I was watching Conrad. My son, 38 years old, 6'2", wearing a $10,000 suit that fit him perfectly, every inch. The successful executive he'd worked 15 years to become stood slowly. His hand left the pen on the table. His shoulders straightened. His face composed itself into an expression of outrage so perfect I almost believed it myself. Almost. "This is outrageous," he said. His voice was smooth, controlled, persuasive, the voice I'd taught him when he was 23 and learning to negotiate shipping contracts. "My father disappeared 5 days ago. We've been searching. The Coast Guard, the FBI, everyone. And now he walks in with federal agents like this as some kind of—" "Mr. Webb." Theron Hardy stepped forward, FBI credentials in hand. "You have the right to remain silent." But Conrad wasn't finished. He was still the best persuader I'd ever known, even now, even with 6 federal officers in the room. He'd inherited it from me, from the 30-year-old version of me who could talk a reluctant client into a 5-year contract, who could turn a hostile negotiation into a partnership. He turned to the board members, ignoring Hardy completely. "There's no evidence," he said, and his voice carried absolute conviction. "My father left voluntarily. He wanted to go fishing, wanted time alone. This is a conspiracy, a hostile takeover attempt using federal intimidation to seize control of the corporation." Miles Sherwood glanced at me, then back at Conrad. Lauren Blackwell's eyes moved between us, salt-weathered father in an ill-fitting suit, impeccably dressed son radiating confidence. The pen hit mahogany with a sound like a gavel. Conrad was still talking. "Where's Beatrix? She'll confirm everything. She was with me when we dropped him at the fishing site. She saw—" "Ms. Richter is in federal protection," Hardy said quietly. "She gave her statement yesterday, all of it." Conrad's voice didn't falter. "Then you know I'm telling the truth. We dropped him at an uninhabited island 60 miles from the nearest settlement," I said. My first word since entering the room. The silence was different this time, heavier. Conrad turned to look at me. Really look at me. His eyes moved from my salt-stained hair to the borrowed suit to the rope burns on my hands, still visible at my cuffs. "Dad." His voice changed softer now, concerned the dutiful son. "What happened? We've been so worried. When you didn't come back from the fishing trip when we couldn't reach you, we thought—" "Stop." He stopped. I looked at my son for a long time, at the face I'd watched grow from infant to child to man, at the eyes that had once asked me why storm skies turned green, at the expression now calculating how much I knew, how much I could prove, how much damage control he needed. For the first time in 38 years, my son couldn't hold my eyes. "Do you remember your grandfather's watch?" I asked softly. Conrad's gaze dropped to my wrist, to the old marine timepiece with its scratched crystal face and salt-stained leather strap. The watch his grandfather had worn crossing the Pacific in 1952. The watch I'd worn every day for 40 years. The watch Conrad had seen 1,000 times and stopped noticing decades ago. Just an old man's sentimental attachment to an outdated timepiece. I watched the understanding move across his face, watched confidence drain like water from a sinking ship, watched him remember the island, our conversation, his confession, every word he'd said, while standing over me in front of that beached Cessna. Every word while I sat there with my grandfather's watch on my wrist, recording mechanism hidden in the antique case, uploading to satellite servers the moment we hit signal range 36 hours later. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "How long?" he whispered. I adjusted my cuff, showing him the watch more clearly. 47 minutes and 23 seconds of audio. His voice saying, "You'll die here, and I'll run the company you built." His voice detailing the Prudhoe Bay fraud. His voice admitting everything. "Long enough," I said. Conrad's gaze locked on the old Marine watch, the one his grandfather wore crossing the Pacific in 1952. The one Conrad thought was just sentiment. His face changed when he understood what 47 minutes of island audio meant. The persuader had nothing left to say. I pressed the button without saying a word. My grandfather's watch had a speaker function modified years ago for recording board meetings, activated by a specific sequence of crown turns. The room's audio system picked up the signal automatically. I didn't explain, didn't offer preamble or context. I just pressed play and let my son's voice fill the boardroom. The recording started with night sounds, waves against rocks, wind through spruce trees, the hollow scrape of aluminum on reef the canoe Conrad had deliberately stranded to make my death look accidental. Then his voice crystal clear in the June Alaskan darkness. "You understand what happens now, don't you?" My own voice older, confused. "The canoe's stuck." "The canoe's not stuck. It's positioned 3 miles offshore on an uninhabited island with no scheduled traffic. The old man becomes prey to predators or dies of thirst within 72 hours. Either way, outdated maritime thinking proves worthless when modern strategy leaves you behind." Gerald Ashford's face went white. Miles Sherwood set his coffee cup down with a clink that seemed loud in the frozen silence. Lauren Blackwell stared at the speaker, then at Conrad, then back at the speaker. The recording continued. 47 minutes and 23 seconds total. Every word, every detail. Conrad explaining the Prudhoe Bay fraud. Conrad describing how he'd disguised the missing funds. Conrad's voice smooth and confident and utterly damning. "The corporation now belongs to my wife and me. The board meeting is just formality. By the time anyone finds your body, if they find it, I'll have been CEO for 3 months. Grief-stricken, son tragic accident, smooth transition." I sat perfectly still in the chairman's chair and watched my son stand rigid 10 feet away, watched the color drain from his face, watched his hands clench and unclench at his sides. No one else moved. Gerald's pen had been halfway to his notepad when the recording started. It stayed there suspended for 5 minutes. 10. 15. The audio was remarkable in its clarity. My grandfather's watch had cost $800 in 1952, worth perhaps $12,000 today, and the recording mechanism I'd installed 5 years ago had cost another $3,000. Money well spent. Every syllable of Conrad's confession came through perfectly. "Beatrix handled the financial restructuring," his recorded voice said. "She's brilliant with shell corporations. The Alaska operation gave us perfect cover, remote location, complex logistics, easy to bury discrepancies in operational costs. $4 million over 18 months, and the auditors never questioned it." Lauren Blackwell put her pen down. Gerald followed. Miles had never picked his up. The recording played on. Conrad's voice describing the island. No fresh water, no shelter, no emergency supplies. Conrad's voice calculating my survival chances. 72 hours maximum. Probably less. He's 65, not the ship captain he used to be. The exposure alone will 45, 46, 47 minutes. The timestamp in the corner of the audio player counted upward. 0, 0, 45, 0, 0, 0, 0, 46, 0, 0, 0, 0, 47, 0, 0. 47 minutes is a very long time when every second destroys your son. The final minute was mostly silence. The Cessna's engine starting, my recorded voice asking where he was going. Conrad's answer, "Seattle. The board meeting is in 4 days. I need to prepare my remarks. Goodbye, Dad." Propeller noise, Fading engine sound, waves, wind. Then my voice barely audible. He's gone. Recording stopped. The timestamp showed 00:47:23, and the playback ended. 10 seconds of absolute silence. Then Theron Hardy stepped forward, warrant in hand. "Conrad Webb," he said, voice formal and empty of emotion. "You are under arrest for first-degree murder, attempted murder, and federal corporate fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Conrad's head snapped up. "Murder, attempted murder. Yes, but I never—" August 23rd, 2023. Hardy continued. Engineer Daniel Moss, age 29, reported missing from Webb Shipping's Valdez operations. Ms. Richter's cooperation with the FBI led us to the island where you abandoned your father. We found traces at the abandoned Camp Blood. Evidence, personal effects, forensic indicators consistent with homicide. Mr. Moss discovered the Predho Bay fraud. You killed him to protect it. The room temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. 3 federal charges, Hardy said. The prosecutor will be seeking consecutive sentences on all 3 counts. No plea, no deal, no negotiation. You will hear the rest from a judge. Conrad looked at me then. Really looked at me for the first time since the recording ended. His face was pale, his expensive suit somehow rumpled, despite perfect tailoring, his hands shaking. I looked back, didn't speak, didn't move. What was there to say the boy who asked about green storm skies was 40 years gone? The man standing here had killed an engineer to hide fraud, then tried to kill his own father for a corporate title. I'd spent 47 minutes listening to his voice describe my planned death. I had nothing left to say to him. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked down at the fallen pen on the mahogany table, the pen that had dropped from his hand an hour ago when I walked through the door. The pen on the floor marked the moment everything changed. Neither of us would ever pick it up. 2 FBI agents moved forward. Handcuffs clicked shut around Conrad's wrists. They read him his rights. The words I'd heard on television 1,000 times surreal when spoken 10 feet from my chairman's seat about my only son. Conrad didn't resist, didn't protest. He walked toward the door between the agent's postures, still straight, still dignified despite the restraints. At the threshold he stopped and looked back at me one final time. I looked back. No words passed between us. No forgiveness, no apology, no farewell. Just 2 men who used to be father and son, understanding that 47 minutes of audio had severed whatever connection remained. The door closed behind them at 9:02 a.m., June 4th. The boardroom fell silent. Gerald Miles and Lauren sat frozen at the table. Agent Hardy gathered his papers. The unsigned transfer documents still lay in front of Conrad's empty chair. I sat alone at the chairman's table in a borrowed suit that didn't fit, staring at a fallen pen. The corporation was mine again, and I had never felt more empty. I placed my hand flat on the table and said, "One more thing the board needs to know." Gerald Miles and Lauren had been gathering their things. Briefcases, phones, coffee cups they hadn't touched since the recording started an hour ago. They stopped. Gerald sat back down slowly. I walked to the door and opened it. In the hallway stood a woman I'd called 2 hours earlier, asking her to bring specific documents to the 40th floor by 9 a.m. Farrah Greer was 46 years old, my private attorney for 11 years. Silver-streaked auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than most of the board members. She'd handled my personal legal matters since my wife died. Estate planning property transfers, the quiet work that happens outside corporate filings. "Ms. Greer," I said, "please come in." She walked to the table and set the briefcase down with a soft thud. Combination lock, 3 clicks, lid open. Inside were documents I'd signed 6 months ago in her downtown office on a January morning when Seattle rain hammered the windows and Conrad had just left from our monthly breakfast meeting. I'd known then, 6 months before the island, before the Coast Guard rescue, before 47 minutes of audio destroyed my son. I'd known and I'd protected what mattered. January 15th, 2024. I said, watching the board members' faces. I placed my personal assets in an irrevocable trust, approximately $80 million in real estate investment accounts and liquid holdings. The trust is managed by Ms. Greer as trustee. Farrah pulled out the documents. I recognize my signature on every page. 23 pages. Total, notarized filed. Legally unbreakable. The sole beneficiary, I continued, is my grandson Nash Webb, age 4. He gains access when he turns 25. No current generation, neither Conrad nor Beatrix, has any claim or control. The assets are protected in perpetuity until my grandson reaches maturity. Lauren's eyes widened. Miles leaned forward. Gerald's expression shifted from confusion to something like admiration. My corporate shares, I added, are separately protected under the existing shareholder agreement, with right of first refusal. Any attempted transfer requires board approval and priority offer to remaining shareholders. Conrad's plan to seize the company was legally void before he ever drugged me. The mathematics were elegant. Conrad had spent 18 months planning fraud, murder, and corporate theft. I'd spent one morning in January signing documents that made all of it meaningless. My son would leave prison with nothing, and his son would inherit everything, the perfect mathematics of consequence. Gerald cleared his throat. Why the grandson? His voice was careful, curious. Why not donate it, dissolve it, anything else? I looked at the unsigned transfer documents, still lying in front of Conrad's empty chair, at the fallen pen on the mahogany floor, at the boardroom where I'd built a company over 40 years, and watched my son try to steal it in 47 minutes of island darkness. Because the child is innocent, I said quietly. I want him to have different choice than his father. No one spoke for 10 seconds. Farah gathered the documents back into her briefcase. 3 clicks, locked. The board will receive copies, I said. For your records, meeting adjourned. They left. Joral first, then Miles, then Lauren. Each one paused at the door, Gerald's hand on my shoulder for 3 seconds. Miles's nod, Lauren's whispered, I'm sorry, that I pretended not to hear. Farah left last briefcase in hand, giving me a look that said she understood what the documents had cost me. What 6 months of knowing had done while I waited for my son to commit every crime record, every word, walk every step toward his own destruction. The door closed. I stood alone in the boardroom for 5 minutes, then left. At 2:30 p.m., I sat in Theron Hardy's office at the FBI building downtown. Gray walls, government-issued desk, coffee that tasted like burnt tar. I drank it anyway. Ms. Richter is pleading guilty, Hardy said, file folder open in front of him. Complicity in corporate fraud accessory to attempted murder. Her proactive testimony and cooperation earn her a significantly reduced sentence under the Federal Cooperation Agreement. 18 months in minimum security, federal facility, followed by 2 years. Supervised release, $500,000 fine, and a permanent ban from serving as chief financial officer at any corporation. He looked up at me. The prosecutor wants to know if you want us to pursue harsher charges. We have enough evidence for a stronger case. She was integral to the fraud, knew about the island plan, helped coordinate it. We could pursue additional counts. I had already spoken with the federal prosecutor that morning before the board meeting in the 30 minutes Hardy had given me to prepare. I told her the same thing I told Hardy now. I spoke with the prosecutor this morning, I said. We agreed that Beatrix's cooperation justified the plea arrangement as written. 18 months is enough time for reflection. I'm not adding personal charges beyond what the federal case already requires. Hardy studied me. That's unusually measured for a man whose life she helped plan to end. Ema's measured is what kept me alive on that island, I said. Conrad made every choice himself. Beatrix made one choice that mattered. She called you instead of waiting to see which way Conrad would move against her. I can work with that. How many lives should one betrayal destroy? Conrad would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. Daniel Moss was dead murdered for discovering fraud. Nash would grow up without a father, inheriting wealth at 25 from a grandfather he barely remembered. Beatrix would lose her career, her reputation, 18 months of her freedom. How many more did justice require? But the CFO ban, I said. That part is non-negotiable. Permanent. No corporate finance authority anywhere ever. Hardy made a note in the file. Already in the agreement. Her attorney didn't even push back on it. Good, I said. Then we're done. He closed the folder, extended his hand. I shook it, his grip firm, professional, the handshake of a man who'd seen me pulled onto a Coast Guard deck 2 days ago and arrested my son this morning. Mr. Webb, he said, I hope you find some peace. I nodded and left. I walked out of the FBI building at 3:40 p.m. into bright June sun downtown Seattle, moving around me like nothing had happened. Office workers on lunch breaks, tourists taking photos of the waterfront, the ordinary machinery of a city that didn't know a father had just destroyed his son. The corporation was secure. Conrad was in custody. Beatrix was handled. My grandson's future was protected. For the first time in 6 months, I had absolutely nothing I needed to do next. The FBI sent me to a private medical clinic before I could even leave downtown. Standard protocol after survival situations, Agent Hardy said. Make sure nothing internal ruptured during the raft journey. Check for delayed shock document physical condition for the trial. Dr. Sarah Brennan was 44 years old. Efficient hands, gray streaked black hair pulled back in a clip, the kind of physician who'd seen enough not to ask unnecessary questions. She checked my vitals, examined the rope burns on my palms, shone a light in my eyes, listened to my lungs. Moderate dehydration, she said, making notes on a tablet. Muscle exhaustion consistent with prolonged physical exertion. Minor abrasions from what looks like plant fiber, probably the raft vines. But overall, given your age and the circumstances I was briefed on, you're in surprisingly good condition. 40 years at sea, I said. She nodded and left me alone in the exam room to change back into the borrowed FBI suit. I sat on the exam bed, paper crinkling under me, and for the first time since walking through those boardroom doors 12 hours ago, I allowed myself to stop moving. Stop planning. Stop executing the strategy I'd built over 6 months of watching my son plot my murder. I sat very still and felt not victory but loss. The corporation was secure. Conrad was in custody. My grandson's future was protected. Everything I'd planned had worked perfectly. I'd won. But I'd lost my son years before that island. Maybe when he was 12 and asked to go fishing and I had a client dinner. Maybe when he was 18 and wanted advice about college, and I was in Vancouver negotiating an acquisition. Maybe when he was 25 and asked why I never said I was proud of him, and I'd answered with a promotion instead of words. 1,000 small losses, and I'd only acknowledged them today. My phone vibrated. Alaska area code. Number I didn't recognize. I answered, "Hello? Is it done?" Elva's voice crackling through what sounded like satellite interference. I paused. "How did you get this number?" Coast Guard coordinated with the tribal council when they filed the rescue report, she said. Robert Whitecloud passed it to me yesterday. A pause filled with wind noise. She was outside, probably on the beach. Old habit. I like to know how things end. She didn't say her name. Didn't explain. We'd spent 3 days together on an island learning to communicate with the economy of people who understand that survival doesn't waste words. It's done, I said. Silence on the line. Static. Wind noise. She was outside somewhere, probably standing on the beach where I'd launched the raft 60 hours ago. The island, I said. Before I walked into that boardroom this morning, my lawyer signed conservation commitment documents. Federal filing. Permanent protection. No development. No exploitation. No mineral surveys. Forever. The tribal council will receive notification within 30 days. More silence. 10 seconds. 15. Then Elva's voice, quieter than I'd ever heard it. Okay. Not thank you. Not promises of friendship or future contact. Just confirmation that I'd kept my word. People who've been betrayed don't trust words, they trust deeds. And Elva had just confirmed I kept mine. The line went dead. I sat in the exam room for another 5 minutes holding a phone connected to nothing before I dressed and left. I postponed the prison visit twice. Once because I told myself I was too busy with corporate restructuring. Once because I admitted I was afraid. July 15th, I finally went. The federal detention center was gray concrete and reinforced glass, and the smell of industrial cleaning solution that couldn't quite mask desperation. They led me to a visiting room phone and partition. No physical contact allowed for pretrial detainees facing life sentences. Conrad came in wearing orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. He'd lost weight. His eyes were red-rimmed. When he picked up the phone on his side of the glass, his hand shook. "Dad!" His voice cracked. "Why are you being so cruel? Why won't you give me a chance? I made mistakes, I know. But you could talk to the prosecutor. You could—" I let him finish. Let him plead. Let him try persuasion one more time, the talent he'd inherited from me, now deployed uselessly against the man who'd taught him. When he finally stopped, I spoke slowly through the glass partition. The night you left me on that island, I said, saying what you said, fatherly love ended. Not because you hurt me, because I realized I hadn't known who my son was for many years. That's partly my fault. I should have seen it, should have paid attention. But it doesn't change what is. Conrad's face crumpled. What do you want from me? I stood up. Nothing anymore. The iron door closed behind me with a sound like finality. I sat in the empty visiting room for 5 minutes before I could stand. Sometimes you need to sit in an empty room to understand the room is truly empty. 2 weeks later, I restructured the corporation. James Caldwell was 52 years old, professional CEO with a 20-year track record running mid-sized logistics companies. No family connection to Webb Shipping, no complicated history. Clean succession. The board approved unanimously. I kept honorary chairman status quarterly visits, advisory role, no operational authority. The trust managed my shares. Caldwell would run the company I'd built for 40 years, and I would finally admit I no longer needed it to know who I was. We met in my old office, my former office, on July 28th. I placed the keys on the mahogany desk. Building Access Executive Suite company car, the small brass key to the file cabinet, where I'd kept personal documents until Farah moved them to her office in January. Caldwell picked them up, professional handshake, firm grip, no drama, no sentiment, just completion. The company's in good shape, he said. I'll take care of it. I know, I said and left. I walked out of the corporate building in late July with no keys, no title beyond honorary, no son and $80 million. Locked away for a 4-year-old grandson who didn't know I existed. Seattle's summer sun felt warm on my face. The waterfront looked exactly the same as it had 2 months ago when I'd flown north, with Conrad believing we were inspecting Alaska operations. The city hadn't changed. I was the only thing that had changed. In August, I met my 4-year-old grandson for the first time since before the island. Not the first time ever. Nash had been born in the spring of 2020, and I had held him once in the hospital, a small red-faced creature who smelled like new life and possibility. After that, Conrad and Beatrix had managed the distance carefully. Busy schedules, conflicting calendars, a grandfather who worked too much, and a young family who needed space. I had accepted those excuses because I was still the man who chose quarterly earnings over fishing trips, board meetings, over school plays. The same man who answered a phone call instead of explaining storm skies to an 8-year-old. Now Conrad was in federal custody, awaiting trial. Beatrix was in a minimum security facility in Tacoma. Nash lived with a court-appointed guardian, a woman named Patricia Holloway, 58 years old, retired social worker, patient, and steady in the way that people become who have spent 30 years, absorbing other people's worst moments without breaking. I had requested the meeting through Farah Greer. 3 weeks of paperwork, background checks, court approval. The family court judge was thorough. She had read every document, the arrest warrant, the FBI case file summary, the trust documents I had signed in January. She had questions about my fitness as a grandparent. Fair questions. A man whose son tried to murder him is not automatically a safe presence for that son's child. I answered every question honestly. The judge approved supervised visits. 2 hours per session, Patricia Holloway present public location. No discussion of Conrad or the legal proceedings. Standard protective order language that I read 3 times and followed without complaint. We met at a small park in Queen Anne, 7 blocks from the apartment, where Nash had lived his entire 4 years. Patricia brought him at 2 in the afternoon. He was wearing a blue jacket with a dinosaur on the pocket, red sneakers with Velcro straps, and an expression of complete indifference to the importance of the moment. He sat on the bench beside me and immediately noticed the scar. I had forgotten about it. The thin white line across my right palm from the driftwood vine, the rope burns, that Dr. Brennan had documented in the medical report, now healed into something permanent. Nash reached out and touched it with one small finger, the way children touch things that confuse them. What happened, Grandpa? I looked at him. 4 years old, blonde hair like his father's at that age, but his mother's eyes quick and dark and already watching everything carefully. Children of complicated households learn to read rooms before they learn to read words. I went to the beach, I said. His eyes went wide. Did you see a shark? Yes, I said, but the shark lost. He stared at me for 3 full seconds, deciding whether this was true. Then he nodded once, the solemn, absolute nod of a child who has made a decision, jumped off the bench, and ran toward the climbing structure at the center of the park, shouting something about pirates. I watched him climb. Patricia sat on the far end of the bench, close enough to supervise, far enough to give the moment its own air. "He talks about sharks a lot," she said quietly. "Watches nature documentaries. His father used to watch them with him on Sunday mornings." I said nothing. Watched my grandson reach the top of the climbing structure and survey the park like a captain checking the horizon. Some things carry forward even when the person who started them is gone. In September, I sat in a downtown conference room while Farah finalized the last piece of business from a list that had taken 3 months to complete. The conservation documents for the island were the final item. It had taken longer than I expected. The legal description required precise GPS coordinates, survey mapping, and coordination between 3 federal agencies: the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the EPA, and the National Park Service Regional Office in Juneau. Farah had handled all of it without complaint, billing me at her standard rate, never once suggesting that the complexity justified cutting corners. The documents transferred the island to permanent protection under the Tribal Council's stewardship. Native American Graves Protection Act designation. Federal environmental overlay preventing any mineral commercial or residential development. Irreversible, not subject to future corporate influence, future legislative amendment at the state level, or a future court challenge from any Webb family member, including myself. I had been explicit about that last point. Farah had raised an eyebrow when I said it. "You want to include yourself in the exclusion?" she had asked. "Especially myself," I said. Robert Whitecloud arrived at 2 o'clock. 71 years old tribal elder, silver hair, braided long, wearing the traditional woven vest over a plain white shirt. He carried nothing, no briefcase, no folder, no phone visible. He sat across the conference table and read every page of the documents, himself, slowly, without asking questions. 20 minutes. Farah sat quietly. I sat quietly. The September sun moved across the conference room floor. When he finished, Robert looked up. "She said you would keep your word," he said. I knew who she was. Elva did not trust easily. When she trusted, she told the people who needed to know. "I am a captain," I said. "A captain does not break promises made at sea." Robert extended his hand across the table. I shook it. Firm grip. The handshake of 2 men who understood that some agreements matter more than anything that can be written on paper, and that the paper exists only to protect the agreement from the people who were not present when it was made. He signed. Farah notarized. I signed as transferring party, relinquishing all Webb family claim to the island in perpetuity. It was done in 4 minutes. Robert gathered the documents, stood and nodded once. Then he said something I had not expected. "There was a man who survived on that island before you," he said. "In 1987, fishing boat went down in a storm. He washed ashore, lived 3 weeks before a passing vessel spotted his signal fire. When he came home, he donated his fishing license to the Tribal Council and never fished those waters again." I looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because that island has a history of making men understand what they owe," he said. "You are not the first. You may not be the last." He left. I sat in the conference room for 10 minutes after Farah had packed her briefcase and excused herself. The September sun was fully across the floor, now warm and flat, the kind of light that makes a room look like a photograph of itself. The island had a name, I realized. I had never asked. For 3 days I had lived on it, built a raft on its shore, slept in its cave, and I had never once asked what it was called. I called Farah back. "The island," I said. "What is its name in the filing?" I heard paper rustling. "Kagan Island," she said. "It's in the tribal language. The council's documentation translates it as the place that returns what was lost." I wrote it down on the conference room notepad. Kagan Island. Tore the page off and put it in my jacket pocket. Some names you carry with you. 2 weeks later, I walked the length of the Seattle Marina on a Saturday morning when the September air still held summer warmth and the water was flat enough to reflect the sky. I had no particular destination. This was new for me, movement without objective walking, without a meeting at the end of it. 40 years of captaining ships had trained me to move with purpose. Every step toward something, every journey with a calculated return. Learning to walk without destination was harder than learning to build a driftwood raft. I passed slips of vessels, I recognized charter boats, Pleasure craft, a few working fishing boats, whose owners I knew by name from decades of maritime business. They nodded when they saw me. I nodded back. None of them asked about the island or Conrad or the federal case that had been in the Seattle papers for 6 weeks. Either they already knew everything or they understood that some things do not require conversation. I stopped at slip 44. The boat was 32 feet, a sloop-rigged sailboat built in the late 90s, with the kind of construction that prioritized durability over elegance. Hull in need of fresh paint, rigging sound, teak deck weathered but solid, the kind of vessel that had worked hard and been maintained honestly. The seller was standing on deck replacing a halyard, Marcus Flynn, early 60s hands that knew ropework face that had spent decades in weather. She for sale, I asked. He looked up, studied me for a moment the way experienced sailors study other sailors. Not appearance, but posture. How a man stands near water tells you what he knows about it. Might be, he said, if the right buyer comes along. We talked for 20 minutes. He answered every question directly and volunteered the problems without being asked: a slight weather helm in strong wind, a raw water pump that had been rebuilt twice and would need replacing within 2 seasons, a depth sounder that occasionally read false in shallow water. A man who tells you what is wrong with what he is selling is a man who has been at sea long enough to know that hidden problems find you eventually. Can this boat reach the Alaska Gulf solo? I asked. He set down the halyard, looked at me steadily. If you know how to sail, he said. I know, I said. We agreed on a price in 10 minutes. No negotiation. The number he named was fair, and we both knew it. I bought the boat that afternoon, paid cash, signed the transfer papers on the dock with Marcus Flynn as witness the September sun. Warm on the back of my neck, the sound of halyards knocking against aluminum masts the whole length of the marina. Marcus asked only one question before I left. Why Alaska? I thought about a cave smelling of smoke and salt, about a woman who had watched me for 2 days before deciding I was worth saving, about currents that do not appear on any chart drawn by men who confuse documentation with knowledge. Because at sea, I said, I always knew exactly who I was. He nodded like that was a complete answer, because to a man who has spent his life on water, it is. In October, I found the journal, a storage box in the back of the workshop behind the house, the same workshop where I had adjusted the satellite module on my grandfather's watch 3 months before Alaska. I had been clearing the space, methodically deciding what to keep and what to release. The workshop held 40 years of accumulated maritime life, old charts, instrument manuals, tools from my first captaincy correspondence from shipping contacts on 3 continents. The box was cardboard sealed with tape that had dried and cracked. My handwriting on the side, personal, 1979 to 1985. Inside, under a folded oilskin jacket and a set of brass dividers, was the journal. Leather-bound spine, cracked pages yellowed at the edges. I opened it to the first entry. June 1982. I was 23 years old, 3rd officer on a bulk carrier, running grain routes between Seattle and Yokohama. The handwriting looked like someone else's, confident, forward-slanting, in too much of a hurry to form letters carefully. A young man's handwriting. Went to sea not to build empire, but because here I know exactly who I am. I read it twice, then a 3rd time. I had written that sentence 42 years ago. A 23-year-old standing on a grain ship in the Pacific, certain about something that the next 4 decades would bury under quarterly earnings reports and board meetings and the slow accumulation of everything that empire requires. I sat in the workshop for a long time with the journal open on my knees. The watch was on the workbench in front of me, my grandfather's marine chronometer, leather strap, replaced now satellite module, removed by the FBI as evidence and returned after the case file was complete. Just a watch again. Just time. The thing it had always been before I made it into something else. I picked it up, felt the weight of it heavier than modern watches. Solid brass and steel. The face yellowed, but the mechanism still perfect. My grandfather wore it crossing the Pacific in 1952. My father wore it on freight routes to Japan. I had worn it on every voyage until I became too important to go to sea. Then I had worn it to an island and back. I put it on my wrist and went back to reading. Now it is December 2024, and I am sitting on the deck of the sailboat I bought in September. The one Marcus Flynn maintained honestly and sold fairly anchored in Puget Sound as the winter light falls early and cold across the water. The journal is in the cabin below. I have read all of it. A young man's record of learning the sea, written in the years before Conrad was born, before the corporation consumed everything, before I forgot the sentence I wrote at 23. Nash has a court date in February. The family court judge will review the guardianship arrangement and determine long-term placement. Farah has filed documentation establishing the trust, the conservation commitment, my financial stability, my criminal background check, clean except for one speeding citation in 1991. The judge will decide. I am not certain what I want from that decision. I know what Nash deserves: stability, consistency, someone present in the way I was not present for his father. Whether I am capable of that is a question I am still honest enough to hold open. Conrad's trial begins in March. I will testify. The 47 minutes of audio will be entered into evidence. I will sit in a federal courtroom and watch prosecutors play my son's voice, admitting to my planned murder, and then I will answer questions under oath about the father I was and the son he became. I am not looking forward to it. I am also not avoiding it. The anchor rope creaks in the current. Somewhere across the sound, a container vessel is running the channel south toward the port. I can see its lights moving slow and steady, the way large vessels always move weight, requiring patience. I used to own ships like that. I may again someday in some form through the trust, through Caldwell's stewardship of what I built. Or I may not. The corporation will continue, whether I am paying attention to it or not. That used to feel like failure. Now it feels like the point. The watch on my wrist reads 7:42 p.m., December cold coming off the water. I think about Elva on her island. Kagan Island, the place that returns what was lost, going about the work of surviving in the way she has for 7 years, alone by choice, clear about who she is, in the way that only people who have stripped everything unnecessary away ever become truly clear. I wonder if she is thinking about the same stars I am looking at now. I suspect she is not thinking about me at all, and that feels exactly right. I think about Nash asking about the shark and the absolute certainty in his nod when I told him the shark lost. I think about the first entry in a leather journal, written by a 23-year-old in 1982, and how long it took me to find my way back to understanding what he meant. If you are reading this, if you have stayed with this story through all its length and weight, then you have something I did not have at 40 or 50 or 60. You have the account of a man who learned too late what he should have known early. Pay attention to the people who ask you questions about storms, not the question itself. The fact that they are asking that they are standing beside you, looking at the same sky, wanting to understand what you understand. That is the whole thing. That is all of it. The rest is just shipping. Mind how you go. And to you listening to my story, remember this. When someone you trust starts acting differently, trust that instinct. Don't make my mistake. I spent 40 years building an empire while my son disappeared inch by inch. I knew every shipping route from Seattle to Singapore, but I didn't know the boy who asked about storm skis had become a man who could calculate my death like a business decision. When family changes, pay attention. Those small moments I chose not to see cost me my son. Here's what I learned. If you have assets worth protecting, see a lawyer today. Put things in writing. If relatives are worrying about you in uncomfortable ways, trust that feeling. And remember, a dad's revenge against family betrayal isn't about anger. It's about protecting the innocent and making sure consequences fall where they belong. You can't save someone from their own choices. I believe God put me through that island to show me who I was, without the empire, without the title, without everything I'd built. What do you think about this story? Have you faced a moment where family betrayed your trust, and you had to choose between protecting yourself or hoping they'd change? Leave a comment and tell me. If this resonated, if you know someone dealing with family betrayal, who needs to hear about a dad's path to revenge through truth, please share it. And for more stories about fathers finding their revenge through justice, subscribe to Dad's Sweet Revenge. Thank you for staying until the very end. As a reminder, certain details were fictionalized for storytelling, but the lessons about trust, preparation, and family are very real.